What if every careless gesture, every fleeting thought, every dream you half remember left ripples, not here, but elsewhere? A smile you never gave, a word you never spoke, a kindness or cruelty that slipped out of you by mistake, echoing into dimensions you cannot see. For the next 3 hours, we'll drift through the haunting idea of lives you brushed against across realities, souls altered by your accidental touch. Let the mystery of unintended consequences guide you to sleep, as unseen versions of you keep reaching outward. Let's start with first. The Forgotten Wanderer. There are stories whispered in strange corners of the world. Stories that refuse to die because they do not belong to the logic we know. Among them is the tale of the Forgotten Wanderer. He was not a ghost, not a dream, but a man who insisted he had once locked eyes with you, a stranger, through the glass of a moving train. Only here, in your version of reality, you never stepped onto that train. You never boarded. You never looked out. And yet, he remembers you. Imagine the unsettling weight of such a claim. A man with no reason to lie approaches you and speaks with quiet certainty. He tells you the exact time, the exact station, even the color of your jacket. He describes the fatigue in your face as if it were a detail carved into memory. And then, he tells you that you never spoke, you never waved. Just one fleeting glance exchanged across a pane of glass in a world that insists it did not happen. This is where the fabric of ordinary life begins to fray. We live assuming memory is anchored to truth, that what we recall has some tether to shared reality. But what if it doesn't? What if memory sometimes holds fragments from elsewhere, from adjacent worlds, from timelines that brushed against ours for a single moment? The Forgotten Wanderer believed this. He claimed he slipped between places not by choice but by accident, and that sometimes people like you became echoes in both. Parallel world encounters sound like fiction, yet history is stained with testimonies that echo this mystery. Travelers who swear they woke in towns that do not exist on any map. Air passengers who land in airports where their passports belong to nations that never existed. Families who remember relatives no one else has ever heard of. Skeptics call it false memory, misfiring neurons, confabulation. But those who lived it describe the raw terror of knowing something happened, while everyone else calls you mistaken. The train window becomes a metaphor here, a transparent barrier, a fleeting glimpse. In his world, you were there. In yours, you were not. This divide is the glass itself, clear enough to make you believe in contact, yet firm enough to insist separation. Psychologists would argue he fabricated the memory to fill a gap. Neurologists would suggest his brain invented you as a placeholder for a stranger. But what unsettles the mind is his absolute certainty. He was not asking you to believe him. He was telling you, because in his reality, the event was unshakable truth. Think of déjà vu, that eerie sensation of having lived a moment before. Science frames it as a temporal glitch, the brain misfiring and processing the present as though it were memory. But what if déjà vu is exactly this? Cross-contamination of parallel lives, a memory not your own bleeding into your awareness. The Forgotten Wanderer's story feels like déjà vu stretched into flesh, made permanent. His memory of you was not just a flicker, it was a fixed point in his reality. And here lies the philosophical terror. If his memory is real there, and your memory is real here, then whose reality holds more weight? Or are both equal, suspended in parallel, each valid to the observer within? What if you are simultaneously the person on the platform and the person on the train, but in different versions of existence, split by an unseen line? Perhaps when you look into mirrors, when you pause at the edge of sleep, fragments of those selves leak through. History offers eerie parallels. In 1954, a man arrived at Tokyo Airport with a passport from a country called Taured, a place that does not exist. Officials were baffled. He insisted his nation lay between Spain and France, and even pointed at it on the map, furious when they told him it was Andorra. His documents were flawless, his money valid in no currency. The next day, both he and his belongings vanished from the secured hotel room where police held him. To this day, his existence remains a riddle. Another forgotten wanderer lost between worlds. And then there are cases like the woman in Spain who woke one morning to find her husband alive beside her. She kissed him, ate breakfast, went to work. Hours later, she confided to her friends that, in her memory, her husband had died 6 months earlier in an accident, and she had grieved endlessly. Her journals, her memories, her emotions, all tied to a life where he was gone. She was left with 2 lives tangled, one where she mourned and one where she had never needed to. The wanderer's eyes, fixed on you through that glass, remind us that the self is not as anchored as we think. Who are you, if in another thread of reality you were someone different? Who are you, if your actions ripple into lives you will never remember? Perhaps you have already brushed shoulders with versions of strangers who swear they know you. Perhaps someone, somewhere, lies awake remembering your face in a place you never stepped foot in. We cling to linearity, the belief that events progress in order, that what is remembered is what occurred. But the wanderer's tale exposes the fragility of this faith. What if memory is not a record, but a radio receiver, sometimes tuned to the wrong station? What if dreams, déjà vu, strange meetings, and impossible recognitions are not errors but glimpses of transmissions from nearby lives? The forgotten wanderer remains a myth, a man swallowed by contradiction. But in his contradiction lies the terror. He knew you. He remembered you. He believed with a conviction unshaken by doubt. And when he disappeared, as so many unexplained figures do, he left behind not proof, but a haunting possibility. That in some train window, in some parallel world, your eyes once met, and neither of you could ever forget it. So tonight, when you step into a station, when you hear the rattle of rails and see the glow of windows passing in the dark, look closely. Somewhere beyond the glass, someone may already be remembering you. The dream poet. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. Someone, somewhere, swears that you came to them in a dream. Not as a shadow, not as a silent figure, but as a poet. They say you leaned close, whispered verses into their heart, and then left them haunted by words you never actually wrote. And when they woke up, the words remained, etched into memory as if carved by your hand. How do you explain something like that? Was it only their subconscious, or did some fragment of you cross into their world without your knowing? These stories, scattered through forums, whispered in late-night conversations, or recalled by people who never once met in waking life, all circle around a strange phenomenon, the idea that another version of you, an echo, a shadow, a dream double, might exist in the minds of strangers, a phantom self that creates without your consent. And though we dismiss it as imagination, there are moments so precise, so vivid, they leave no room for easy dismissal. Imagine a stranger reciting back to you a poem that feels like your own style, your rhythm, your breath, but one you never set to paper. Where does that come from? Is it chance, or something deeper, something unnervingly real? Psychologists might call it cryptomnesia, the brain's tendency to weave fragments of memory into something that feels new. But cryptomnesia cannot explain why the dreamer insists it was you. Not someone like you, not a blur of faces. You, the way you move, the way your voice lingers, as though the boundary of self dissolved in sleep, and your essence bled into their imagination. And you're left asking, if I can haunt a dream I never entered, then what else am I doing when I'm unaware? There is an eerie intensity in these accounts. Consider this. A woman wakes up shaken, writing down lines of poetry she claims a man whispered to her in a dream. Later, in an uncanny twist, she meets someone in real life whose face and voice match that dream figure almost perfectly. He insists he has never written poetry, never said those words, never even dreamed of her. Yet she reads them back, and he feels the chill. The cadence is his. The ideas are ones he privately wrestled with but never spoke aloud. Did her mind steal them from the air? Or did some version of him slip loose while he slept and travel into her world? Think, too, of how often humanity has described inspiration, as if it comes from elsewhere. Poets claim they are merely vessels. Musicians say songs write themselves. Mystics insist voices in dreams handed them wisdom. What if all of this isn't metaphor? What if creation is a web, and in sleep, our minds wander across invisible strands, brushing against others, carrying fragments back like pollen? Perhaps you are a dream poet without knowing, scattering verses into strangers' nights, never aware of the worlds you touch. And then, the haunting question. Who, in turn, whispers into your dreams? When you wake with a line in your head, convinced you've thought it before but never written it, How do you know it didn't belong to someone else? Maybe we are all trading fragments of ourselves across dreamscapes, never knowing the source. Maybe originality is just the illusion that no one remembers the exchange. Consider how this bends the idea of identity. If another version of you exists in the imagination of strangers, then you is not confined to the body you wake in. You exist in their memory, their dreams, their words. You are multiplied, refracted, scattered like shards of glass. And the version of you they know may act in ways you never did. In one life, you are silent. In another, you are a poet whose verses ache like prophecy. But which one is truer, the self you control or the selves you unknowingly inspire? This is not merely philosophy. Entire movements of art and literature have sprung from dreams. Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed he wrote Kubla Khan after waking from a vision. Mary Shelley dreamt of a scientist who gave life to the dead and woke to write Frankenstein. Carl Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, a shared dream space that feeds us images older than our own minds. And countless ordinary people, like the ones who swear a stranger whispered words into their sleep, bear quiet testimony that the boundaries between us are not as firm as we believe. So imagine the weight of this. Somewhere, someone may carry a line of poetry in their heart, believing it was yours. They may attribute to you a beauty, a sorrow, a wisdom you never expressed. And they may never know you as more than a dream figure who once leaned close and whispered something unforgettable. Isn't that, in its own way, a form of immortality? To live on in the untraceable archives of other people's dreams? But it is also unsettling. Because if pieces of us wander into places we do not choose, then how much of ourselves do we really own? How do we guard the sanctity of thought if thought itself drifts beyond us? When the dreamer wakes, clutching verses they swear came from your lips, you are faced with a paradox. Either they invented you whole, or you exist in more places than you can bear to imagine. And so, the next time you wake with a phrase lingering at the edge of memory, ask yourself, was that line yours? Or was it gifted by a stranger you'll never meet? Perhaps, somewhere, even now, a version of you is leaning down to whisper into another's sleep. And perhaps, when they wake, they will carry the ghost of your words for the rest of their life, haunted by a poet who never wrote them. The Broken Clockmaker. They called him the Broken Clockmaker, not because he lacked skill, but because time itself seemed to fracture in his hands. In another world, far from ours, he lived quietly, tinkering with gears and springs, repairing watches for villagers who measured their days by the rhythm of ticking seconds. Yet, behind the hum of his workshop, something more dangerous was being born. It began, they say, with a single conversation about time, brief, fleeting, almost forgettable. A stranger passed through, a traveler with words that lodged like a splinter. What if time isn't a straight line, but a circle with cracks? The question festered in him. That night, surrounded by the smell of oil and brass, he began dismantling not just clocks, but reality itself. Night after night, he dismantled the concept of time the way he dismantled brass gears. What if seconds were not real, but choices? What if the hours we cling to are only scaffolds for memory? He began to construct not just clocks, but devices, strange machines of glass and polished wood, that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Some said when you stood near them, you felt as though the past leaned closer, whispering your name. Others swore that the machines showed glimpses of futures not yet lived. Soon the clockmaker no longer repaired timepieces for villagers. He was engineering the very fabric of existence, one fragile tick at a time. The invention that emerged was not a clock, but a fracture, a device that bent the certainty of time into a pliable thread. Imagine for a moment holding a machine that could show you the echo of tomorrow. Would you live differently, knowing which paths broke your heart and which led to triumph? The villagers did. At first they used it cautiously, asking the machine about crops, weather, or whether journeys would be safe. But then came questions of betrayal, of power, of who would live and who would die. Each answer rewrote the present. Each glimpse rearranged the future. And with every choice, reality itself began to buckle. The world around him shifted. Kings demanded audiences. Priests condemned him as heretic. Lovers begged him to rewind their last kiss. The clockmaker himself grew gaunt, obsessed with correcting the distortions he had unleashed. For each glimpse of the future altered the present, and each alteration rippled backward. People began to recall events that had never happened. Wars won by generals who had never drawn a sword, children mourning parents who were still alive, whole histories erased and rewritten with every turn of the gears. Villages rose and fell not by famine or flood, but by the collapse of certainty itself. And yet at the heart of this chaos was one man, broken not by failure, but by vision. He had glimpsed too deeply into the mechanism of time and realized it was never a river, but a fragile mirror, one that shatters the moment we try to polish it. His invention reshaped his world, yes, but it also destroyed it. For the villagers no longer trusted their own memories, nor the ticking of the sun across the sky. They trusted only the machine, and in doing so, they surrendered their free will. They lived not in the present, but in the shadows of what might be. The story of the Broken Clockmaker is not one of triumph, but of warning. We too live by clocks, by minutes, deadlines, calendars etched into our days. But what if time is less a master and more a fragile construction of our minds? Consider déjà vu, that eerie sense of reliving a moment, or the way memory bends, two people witnessing the same event, later telling two different stories. Isn't that, in its own way, a fracture in time? Modern science tells us the brain does not record reality, but reconstructs it, like a clockmaker rebuilding gears from fragments, prone to errors, illusions, and cracks. Think of moments when you wish to go back. Change a word spoken, undo a choice. But every correction would ripple forward, altering not just your future, but everyone else's. Or think of anticipation. Knowing too much of what lies ahead robs us of the present. The clockmaker's people lost themselves, not because time betrayed them, but because they betrayed themselves by peering too far, by mistaking glimpses for certainties. And so, his workshop fell silent. The machines gathered dust, their gears locked forever. Some say the clockmaker vanished into his own invention, lost in a loop of moments he could never escape. Others whisper that he still ticks inside all of us, in that uneasy feeling that the moment we are living has already been lived before. Whether myth or memory, his story is a fracture we carry, a reminder that time is both the gentlest companion and the most dangerous illusion. So the next time you hear a clock ticking, pause. Ask yourself, are you listening to the sound of seconds passing, or the echo of your own choices echoing back at you? For in the silence between ticks lies the same truth the Broken Clockmaker discovered. Time is never what it seems, and once you dare to reshape it, it will reshape you in return. The Silent Astronomer. If I told you that tonight the universe blinked, and in that blink a man with frost on his sleeve saw your face where no face should be, would you believe me? He is alone on a rooftop that smells of rust and cold coffee. The city sleeps below. The sky is a cathedral of black glass above, and between them sits his telescope like a quiet confession. He has spent years memorizing the language of specs, the thin sliver of a waxing moon, the swollen ember of Mars, the breath of a nebula spreading like ink in water. To him, distance is a soundless storm you endure with patience. You wait. You adjust. You breathe. You learn to love the delay. He angles the tube toward a bright star near the horizon, lets the crosshairs kiss it, and then there you are. A soft outline in the eyepiece, a brief human curve where there should be only light. Not a face exactly, more like the idea of one. Cheek, brow, a suggestion of mouth, hovering in the glass as if the sky, in its boredom, had decided to try portraiture. He jerks back, then leans in, until his eyelashes sweep the cup and the instrument becomes an extra eye grafted to his own. The shape dissolves. He exhales. He steadies his hands and looks again. The star is steady now, but the feeling lingers like a name on the tip of the tongue. He does not speak because the night is sacred and words would be clumsy. He lets the image rattle his certainty like a key in a lock he thought was long broken. He has read about atmospheric tremors, about the way warm air from rooftops makes a star dance, about lenses that whisper lies if you beg them to. He knows a face can appear where only a pupil should be, but knowing and seeing do not always belong to the same family. For a breath-long interval, he is simply a witness, and witnesses are dangerous. They can make a world from a rumor. What did he really see? Perhaps you were just an echo, a ghost born of optics. The eyepiece is a stack of lenses caged in metal, each surface a place where the world can split. Light races from a star, travels for years, and then, at the last second, bounces off a millimeter of glass and makes a tiny counterfeit. Astronomers call them ghosts, pale off-axis doubles. that drift when you move your head. There are other phantoms too, tucked inside every living eye. The Purkinje images, micro-mirrors of the cornea and lens that slide when we turn our gaze. A fleck floating in the vitreous can throw a shadow the brain mistakes for a visitor. Blink, and the universe edits itself. But suppose it wasn't a mistake. Suppose the mirror inside his instrument met the mirror inside his memory, and the two became a door. Suppose you were never in his eyepiece at all, but in the thin chamber of belief where the strangest things survive. There is a gravity to yearning as strong as any planet's, a pull that bends the path of attention until the missing person appears. The heart preselects its evidence, the mind obliges. And even if it was only that, only the ache of a human animal brave enough to look up, does that make it less real to the one who felt seen? Think of all the times we have looked up and been tricked, and yet transformed. Sailors mistaking Venus for a lantern drifting on the sea. Climbers startled by the Broken specter, their own magnified shadows, crowned with rainbow halos, looming on walls of fog. Generations persuaded that Mars was cut by canals, artifacts of a civilization whispering from across the void. Even the hum of quasars once sounded like a code. To gaze at the sky is to gamble against illusion. And yet, we keep playing because sometimes the illusion itself becomes the truth we need. On his rooftop, the Silent Astronomer writes in his notebook, but tonight his pen pauses. How do you catalog a visitation? He could call it internal reflection. He could note, stray light, angle 13 degrees. He could label it fatigue. Or he could leave the line blank, a silence shaped like faith. Because once someone had stood beside him here, laughing at the eclipse mark the eyepiece left on their skin. They are gone now. But like a star, their light lingers long after the source has burned out. He does not speak of them, but their absence is the truest lens he owns. So he lingers longer than he should, letting the night behave like film slowly developing. He knows that every observation carries the observer smuggled inside it. The map contains the map maker. The image contains the desire of the hand that focused it. His longing is braided with the optics. His silence is etched into the starlight. Even if meaning is only reflection, it still warms him like a fire on a frozen night. Tomorrow, he will walk among commuters, anonymous, hurried. But beneath his ribs, something will hum like a hidden generator. The secret that for one night, he saw you beyond his sky. And for one night, he believed the universe had noticed him back. Maybe it was only a ghost of glass. Maybe it was his own reflection, arriving from the deep. But to him, it was enough. For the rest of his nights, he will look up and expect to be seen. And if you have ever mistaken your reflection for someone waving, or heard your name in static, or found a message in the ordinary weather of your life, then you already know what he saw. Admit it. A part of you believes in visitors too. Not aliens, not angels, but the return of your own light, traveling so far and so long that when it touches you again, it feels like proof. So let the story stand as it was. A stargazer, silent by temperament and reverent by habit, caught your reflection in his telescope's glass and felt, for a heartbeat, that he had been noticed by the sky he worshipped. It changed nothing measurable. It changed everything that mattered. The Nameless Child. There are moments so fleeting that we almost forget them the instant they pass. Moments we assume dissolve into the blur of everyday life. Yet sometimes, those moments are not forgotten. Sometimes, what seems small to us becomes eternal to someone else. Imagine this. You are walking down a street, lost in your own thoughts, when you hear the soft sound of a child crying. You do not know their name. You do not know their story. Yet instinct makes you pause. You bend down, you smile, you whisper a kind word, maybe even offer a gentle hand on their shoulder. And then, without even thinking twice, you walk away, returning to your own world. For you, the moment vanishes into nothing. But for that child, it becomes everything. It becomes the anchor of safety, the memory they hold when the world feels cruel, the fragment of light they carry into adulthood. They may not even remember your face. They may not even know who you were. To them, you are only the nameless stranger who comforted them when no one else did. Think about how strange and powerful that is. A 5-second interaction, forgotten by you, yet remembered by them for a lifetime. This is the paradox of human memory. We imagine our legacies are carved by grand actions, but so often they are etched by the smallest ones. A soft voice in the dark, a hand that steadies trembling shoulders, a stranger who chooses to stop instead of walking past. These fragments are not small at all. They become the foundation of a life, and the child who once cried on that forgotten street may grow into an adult who, in their own quiet way, passes that memory forward, offering safety to someone else, repeating a cycle that began with you. Psychologists call this phenomenon flashbulb imprinting. Emotional states amplify memory. The child's world in that moment was filled with fear, loneliness, maybe even despair. Then, out of nowhere, your presence broke the storm. That contrast made your kindness unforgettable. And what's astonishing is that you might never know it. You could live your whole life unaware that somewhere out there, a grown man or woman carries inside them the echo of your voice, the warmth of your gesture, the proof that the world can hold kindness even in its darkest corners. You are their invisible savior, the nameless child's protector, and they never stopped remembering. Consider how fragile human development is. A single harsh word can wound for decades, while a single act of compassion can build a foundation of resilience. The child who cried that day could have grown up feeling abandoned, invisible. But your moment, your presence, shifted something. It whispered to them that safety exists, that not everyone walks away, that the world, though cruel, also carries kindness. And this tiny thread could weave into every decision they make afterward. The friendships they pursue, the love they allow themselves to receive, even the way they comfort their own children. Entire futures altered by seconds. We often underestimate this ripple effect. We think only big actions matter. We wait for moments of grandeur, for the world to place us on a stage, to make us heroes in front of crowds. But the truth is, history is full of nameless figures whose smallest gestures shape destinies. The teacher who lent a book that ignited genius. The nurse who held a soldier's hand as he bled. The stranger who smiled at someone on the verge of ending their life. These are not names carved in stone, but they live in the memory of those they touched, and through them, they live in every ripple that spreads outward. Now pause and ask yourself, how many nameless children have you crossed paths with? How many lives carry the fingerprints of your presence without you ever knowing? Perhaps the man who thanked you for holding the door still remembers it on his worst days. Perhaps the woman you once comforted in silence still tells the story of your kindness. Perhaps the child who once cried in your presence still recalls the way your voice soothed their fear. You may think you live unnoticed, but you are woven into countless stories, some of which will never reach your ears. You are the echo in someone's memory, the shadow of comfort in someone's heart. And what about the opposite? How many times have you been the nameless child? How many moments in your own life were salvaged by the unexpected kindness of a stranger? Maybe it was the bus driver who waited when you were late, the passerby who helped when you fell, the nurse who whispered reassurance during pain, the teacher who believed in you when others did not. Do you remember their names? Perhaps not. But you remember the feeling. You remember that moment of safety. That sudden reminder that the world was not as cold as you thought. These strangers live inside you, their presence etched into your memory, even if their names have long been forgotten. It is here we touch something almost sacred, that humans, fragile and flawed, can leave immortal imprints in each other through acts so small they seem invisible. A nameless gesture becomes a timeless legacy. And this is why philosophers say that kindness is a form of immortality. Long after your body is dust, your smallest act can continue to breathe in someone else's story. You may never know it, but the child remembers. The child always remembers. So when you walk through life, understand this. Every passing interaction holds weight. The smallest kindness may be forgotten by you, but it can become the cornerstone of someone else's universe. You do not need to change the world in one sweeping act. You only need to leave behind fragments of light, one moment at a time, because to the nameless child, that fragment may be the difference between despair and hope. And one day, when that child is grown, they may offer the same fragment to someone else, never realizing they are echoing you. The nameless child becomes the nameless adult who carries the memory of you. And that is how we shape eternity, not through fame, not through power, but through those brief unrecorded seconds where compassion becomes a lifeline. The child may never know your name, but in their memory, you are forever the person who gave them safety when they needed it most. And perhaps, in the secret mathematics of the universe, that is the greatest legacy any of us could ever leave behind. The drowning stranger. You dreamed of a shoreline you've never walked, a crescent of pale sand and black stones glinting like wet stars. In the dream you knew the water, the way a hand knows its own bones. You felt the cold pull of the current, the hush before the undertow clenched its fist. There was shouting, far away, muffled as if wrapped in seaweed, and then everything narrowed to a single human shape thrashing where the waves broke. You did not think. You cut through the water like a memory returning to itself. You reached the stranger. You felt the drag on their limbs, the sudden animal weight of panic. You turned them onto their back, kept their face toward the sky, counted breaths against the rhythm of the swell, and kicked and kicked and kicked until the sand rose to meet your feet. When the ocean finally unclenched its hand, the stranger coughed, eyes open, astonished to be alive. They looked at you as if they were learning the word for gratitude for the first time. You woke with salt on your tongue. But here you have never waded past your ankles. Here you only dreamed of swimming that shore. How long can an unreal act shape a real life? The day after the dream, you reach for a glass, and your forearms ache with a tiredness that feels earned. The smell of thawed kelp lives behind your breath. Your calves remember the burn of kicking against an invisible weight. You catch yourself scanning crowds for a face that hasn't happened. You find yourself reading about rip currents at midnight, learning how the safest way back is sideways, how survival is not a contest of strength, but of angle. You memorize the signs, a channel of darker water, foam marching seaward, a notch in the sandbar where the ocean empties itself through a narrow door. You study diagrams as if trying to pass a test that no one said was coming. What if the test already happened, somewhere you can't point to on a map? What if the ocean keeps more than fish and secret wrecks? What if it keeps little drawers of moments, filed under different coastlines, stitched to different moons? Perhaps the life where you swam out exists like a negative pressed against this one, a twin exposure that leaves faint images on your skin, a phantom limb of fate, a bruise in time where two versions of you collided. One who never learned to swim, one who came back carrying a breath they had borrowed for someone else. You begin noticing other seams. A wet ring on the table where no glass stood. A shell in your pocket that belongs to no beach you've known. A faint white scar across your knuckles, as if a ring had scraped you when you were pulling a wrist toward air. Explanations arrive like lifeboats with thin hulls. You brushed against a branch. You picked up the shell at a market. You knocked the table. But the simpler story, the one with the stranger, and the look they gave you when the world returned, keeps slipping into focus, as patient as the tide. Maybe you are not haunted. Maybe you are simply remembering across the grain of realities, the way light travels across water and arrives somewhere else as a different color. If every decision throws a pebble into a quiet bay, every ripple must drift outward and touch other shores. Perhaps your rescue crossed a seam. Perhaps the gratitude in their eyes kept walking after the moment ended and found you here, a feeling without a reason, asking to be understood. Think of how bodies carry unspoken languages, how a parent reaches out without looking when a child stumbles, how a lifeguard can feel a struggle brewing before the head vanishes, how your own chest tightens when someone across the street inhales wrong. Instinct is memory that forgot where it learned itself. Many lives may be speaking into your nerves at once, teaching you skills you never practiced, the way a dream will put a perfect sentence in your mouth in a language you don't think you know. Some mornings you stand by a sink, you look at the tap, and you feel your hands shape themselves around a different task, clearing a mouth of water, sealing your lips to theirs, counting compressions, trusting the sternum to lift like a stubborn door. You look down, and the sink is only a sink. You breathe, and the room returns. But the instruction stays. Skeptics will say it is a story your mind assembled from driftwood and rumor. They will call it confabulation, filling the gaps with the nearest available pieces. A headline read, half awake, a video of a rescue, the raw hunger to matter. They will say dreams are rehearsals for danger we hope never meets us. They may be right. Yet, a rehearsal can make a performance possible. A practice life can prepare a real one. And sometimes the script from elsewhere slips into your pocket, ink still damp. So, imagine this. You're walking the real shore, the only one you own, and the day is ordinary. Dogs throwing themselves into waves, the hiss of retreating foam, the sun writing silver letters you can't read. You tell yourself you came just to walk, just to listen. But a part of you that does not care about sentences is tracking the waterline with quiet arithmetic. You're watching for the darker ribbon, the slight outward flow, the stillness behind broken surf. You scan the water like someone who owes a debt. When the shouting comes, it is small at first, a human sound smudged by wind, then clearer, then a name. You do not remember deciding. Your shoes are in your hands and then nowhere at all. Cold climbs your legs like a rumor becoming a fact. Your breath goes thin. You angle sideways, just as the diagrams taught you. You become a set of decisions learned in a life that is not yours, and yet is entirely yours in this moment. There is a hand. There is the weight. There is the voice that doesn't sound like yours saying, "I've got you. Keep looking at the sky." The ocean, surprised to find you shaped exactly like the person from your dream, loosens its grip. The two of you arrive at the brackish place where fear drains and air begins again. The stranger coughs. You hear the animal rasp of lungs reopening. The world narrows and widens at once. People run toward you, bringing towels and questions. Someone says, "You saved them." But that is not how it feels. It feels like a message delivered to the correct address at last. Later, alone, you shake without warning. It is not fear. It is the delayed arrival of the other shoreline, the one that sent you its script. You realize that the border between lives might be less like a wall and more like the tide line, moving with the moon's mood. Some days the sea comes farther up the sand, leaves its small gifts and strange weeds, then recedes, as if embarrassed by its own generosity. Some days it is stingy, keeping what it keeps. You cannot control it. You can only be ready when it decides to lay a path between worlds glossy and clear enough to walk. Maybe the truth is simpler and more sacred than theories. Kindness is contagious across realities. The act of reaching into danger to lift another face toward air writes itself into neighboring pages. Somewhere a version of you learned, tried, survived, and the wisdom spilled over, a tide crossing a low isthmus. Or somewhere a version of you failed, and the ache for a different outcome pressed this you forward an instant faster. Either way, the bridge was built by care, not by certainty, not by proof, but by the quiet vow you make each time you see a living thing struggle. If I can, I will. As night folds over the water, you think of the stranger, the one from the dream, the one from the day, and you wonder if they will ever feel the echo. Perhaps they will stand at their window during a storm and feel a sudden heat in their hands, as if holding another life for a heartbeat. Perhaps they will wake with a taste of salt and a word on their tongue that is only the sound of gratitude wearing a human shape. Perhaps they will never know. That is fine. Not every bridge needs footsteps to be real. You cannot prove any of this to anyone who asks. You cannot frame it, cannot sell it, cannot even speak of it without sounding like the ocean when it tries to explain itself to the shore. But that is the beautiful cruelty of water. It erases your footprints as you make them, and still you must walk. So you keep walking. You keep learning the angles. You keep listening for the subtle grammar of waves and wind. And when a voice rises thin over the surf, when a hand vanishes and reappears, when the world tilts and some old instruction in your bones wakes up like a lighthouse relit, you go. You go because you already went, once upon a shore that may never meet this one. You go because you dreamed the ending and finally arrived at the beginning. You go because in the great ledger the ocean keeps, there is a line with your name and a blank space beside it, waiting for the number of breaths you will return. If the tide crosses the border tonight, let it find you ready. If a stranger calls, let them find you near. And if the dream comes again, the same shore, the same dark ribbon of water, do not argue with it. Lives are long, but moments are brief. Some belong to two worlds at once. The war survivor. Imagine this, a war-torn street, smoke still heavy in the air, the sound of distant artillery fading into silence. Amid the rubble, a soldier lies wounded, halfway between surrender and the fading pull of death. Their body is broken, their hope fractured, their will to live nearly gone. And then, a stranger passes. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was someone like you. A fleeting act. A hand offering water. A torn cloth pressed against a wound. A whisper that said, "Hold on, you're not alone." It was small. So small, you barely thought about it again. But for them, it was everything. It was the spark that tilted the balance between life and death. That soul, once on the edge, chose to live. They carried your kindness like an ember in the dark. And because they lived, their story unfolded. They returned home, healed, built a family. Children were born. Those children grew, had families of their own. Generations emerged, each one existing, because in a moment of silence between explosions, you gave a stranger the will to survive. Think about the weight of that. How many lives ripple outward from a single act you've already forgotten? That smile, that gesture, that fragment of compassion. It might echo through centuries. Somewhere today, someone might be laughing, breathing, building, simply because a wounded soldier decades ago decided not to give up after a stranger's touch, reminded them that humanity still exists, and you will never know their names. They will never know yours. Yet your fates are intertwined, bound by a moment neither of you could have predicted. We think of war as destruction, as the erasure of futures. But hidden within its chaos are these fragile threads of mercy that preserve futures against impossible odds. There are stories, letters from survivors who wrote decades later about a stranger's hand that lifted them, about a soldier saved not by strategy, but by kindness. One German soldier in World War I described how a British medic, instead of finishing him, stopped his bleeding. He went on to live, marry, and have grandchildren who would one day read his diary in awe, realizing that their entire existence rested on the mercy of an enemy who showed him compassion when he least expected it. This is the terrifying and beautiful truth. The future is shaped not only by battles, victories, or treaties, but by the smallest gestures between human beings. One glance, one word, one act of courage or kindness can ripple into centuries. You may never know the weight of your actions, but they may be carrying lives forward even now, and perhaps this should unsettle you. Because if something as small as passing someone water can echo across generations, then every cruelty can do the same. Every silence in the face of suffering, every withheld kindness, each choice we make plants a seed of despair or of survival. The world we inherit is built on these forgotten moments. So, think about it now. Somewhere perhaps you have already altered history. Perhaps your fleeting kindness already echoes in the heartbeat of a child laughing in a city you've never been to. Perhaps a family tree flourishes today only because you once showed mercy in a moment where indifference would have been easier. You will never know it, but they are alive because of you. And maybe that is what survival really means. Not just living through war, but carrying forward the proof that compassion can endure even in the darkest places. The war ends, the guns fall silent, the rubble turns to dust, but the kindness remains. It lives in the generations that follow, in the stories told at tables, in the faces of those who never even knew how close they came to not existing at all. That is the quiet immortality of compassion. To shift the course of a single life is to alter the destiny of countless others. And somewhere, right now, the echo of your kindness may be breathing, walking, and shaping a world you'll never see. The Lost Cartographer. They called him the Lost Cartographer, though he was never truly lost. He was the one who made others lose their way. In another thread of reality, he wandered with parchment and ink, sketching lines that were not merely roads or rivers, but veins of possibility. And the strangest part? The maps were not his alone. They were born from a single casual moment. A conversation, a fleeting exchange, when someone, perhaps someone like you, gave him directions. A shrug, a gesture of the hand. Take the path by the hill, turn where the trees bend. Words meant to guide, forgotten almost instantly. But in his world, those words became law, became compass, became destiny. He began to draw the path not as it was, but as he imagined it should be. An entire continent shifted beneath his pen. At first, his maps were small, harmless, sketches for travelers who wanted shortcuts through valleys or routes avoiding marshes. But each time he redrew, the landscape seemed to bend toward his design. A hill flattened where he had inked a plain. A river curved because his quill demanded it. People who trusted his parchment swore the land itself had obeyed his ink. And so, the cartographer grew bolder. He stopped recording the world and began inventing it. Cities appeared where none had stood. Mountains rose on his paper. And before long, explorers returned from their journeys, claiming those places were real. They carried back fruit from orchards that never grew before, and spoke of ruins that no history had recorded. His maps had become spells, not guides, blueprints for a world that had never existed here. Imagine what it means to live in a land where reality bends to imagination. A farmer, weary of poor soil, would beg the cartographer to redraw his fields upon richer ground. A merchant would ask for a port where there was only rock, and soon ships docked on shores that had never known the sea. But with each stroke of ink, the lines between invention and truth blurred. Families became divided. One swore they had lived for generations in a mountain village, while their own neighbors insisted that no such place had ever existed until last season. Memories fractured, history splintered, and the world became a labyrinth where certainty was a luxury no one could afford. The cartographer himself grew obsessed. He stopped speaking in ordinary words and spoke only in coordinates, latitudes, and symbols. His companions said he no longer looked at people's faces, but at the imagined borders behind them. To him, a friend was not flesh and blood, but a landmark waiting to be placed on a map. He began to redraw not just land, but destiny, sketching kingdoms that would rise, empires that would crumble, and routes armies would march upon long before a single step had been taken. Kings grew terrified of him, for his ink could undo centuries of conquest with a single curve. Priests condemned him, for his maps rivaled holy scripture. And yet, all the while the common people clung to his designs, because following them gave them a strange, almost divine sense of purpose. But what happens when a map no longer shows where you are, but where someone else insists you should be? That is where his world began to fracture. Lovers lost each other, because on one map, a road joined their towns, and on another, the same road diverged. Armies marched into victories that never existed, only to find themselves stranded in landscapes that contradicted memory. Children grew up swearing they were born in cities that half the world denied. The map was no longer the territory, it was greater than the territory, and reality bent beneath its weight. Think of our own lives for a moment. Are we not, in some way, cartographers of memory and belief? A casual story told by someone else becomes a compass for us. A sentence from a parent, a teacher, a stranger. Go here, don't do that. This is the path. Etches itself into our minds, and suddenly our whole life seems to bend toward it. Entire destinies are redrawn by words spoken without intention. A student discouraged from dreaming becomes an adult who never attempts. A traveler warned away from one path, chooses another, and never meets the person who might have changed their life. Each careless direction we absorb becomes a line on the invisible map of who we are. And when we compare our maps, do we not also argue, insist, defend them, as though reality itself obeys our design? The Lost Cartographer's tragedy was not that he lied, but that he believed too much in the power of lines. He believed that if he drew them clearly enough, reality would obey. And for a time, it did. But no map can hold the totality of a world. Each one leaves something out. Each border, each edge, is also an erasure. And soon, people realized his maps did not just create, they destroyed. Villages disappeared, languages were forgotten, memories collapsed into silence. The more he drew, the more was lost. Until at last, the cartographer himself disappeared into his own parchment. They say he walked across a line he had inked too boldly, and the map consumed him, folding him into a world that no one else could enter. Yet, traces of him remain. In every dream of a place you've never been, but swear you've walked through. In every déjà vu that convinces you a street is familiar, though your feet have never touched it. In the way some landscapes feel like memories and some cities feel like ghosts. Perhaps we all carry his maps, fragments of a world never here but always close, written into us by words, gestures, directions we once heard and never forgot. So the next time someone points and says, "Go that way," pause before you step. Ask yourself, are you following the land beneath your feet or the ink of someone else's imagination? For the story of the Lost Cartographer reminds us of a simple, terrifying truth. The lines we follow, even casually drawn, may not just guide us. They may redraw the very world we walk upon. The shattered twin. Imagine walking through a crowded street when a stranger suddenly freezes, staring at you with the kind of shock that only recognition can summon. Their lips tremble as if they are about to say a name that belongs to you, but isn't yours. And then, with a voice cracking under the weight of disbelief, they whisper, "Brother, sister, is it really you?" In that moment, their entire reality fractures, because in the world they come from, you are not a stranger at all. You are their twin, their other half. their mirror that has walked beside them through every scar and secret. But here, in this world, you have never met them before. There is a strange terror in being seen so deeply by someone you do not know. Their eyes do not search you like an ordinary passerby's. They trace your features like they are rediscovering something stolen. A mark on your arm, a crease in your smile, a faint scar near your brow. These are not accidents to them, but memories. In their voice, you can hear the fragments of a childhood they claim you once shared, the broken swing in the backyard, the nights hiding from storms under the same blanket, the accident that left both of you bleeding but alive. They speak as if these are truths carved into the marrow of your being. And though you may shake your head, insisting you've never lived such a life, something inside you shudders, because even denial cannot erase the strange pull of recognition. What if the universe does not protect the singularity of a person? What if identity is not fixed, but fractured, multiplied, scattered across dimensions like shards of a mirror dropped on the floor of existence? In their dimension, you may have been born together, inseparable, reflections of the same origin. But in this one, the thread snapped, and you were left to grow apart, never knowing the phantom who still remembers you. The scars on your body, innocent remnants of accidents and falls, become symbols in their eyes, proof that the story they carry is real. For them, every line on your skin is not random, but a chapter from a book they have already read. Consider how fragile memory is, how easily it bends. Twins in our world sometimes speak of phantom pains, one feeling the injury of the other, as though their nerves are still entangled across space. They dream the same dreams. They wake in the same hour of the night without knowing why. So, what happens when the boundary between worlds is thin enough that one version of you bleeds into another? Could it be that scars themselves are universal constants, etched into the flesh of every version of you, as if pain has its own way of crossing dimensions? Imagine being told that the wound you carry is not yours alone, but a mark repeated across countless selves, so that you are never truly separate from the stranger who swears you are their twin. And what would you do, faced with this impossible claim? Laugh it away as delusion? Dismiss them as broken? Or would you secretly wonder why their eyes felt like home? Why their voice cracked open something buried in your chest? Because maybe the truth is not in the proof, but in the recognition itself. When someone looks at you and sees not just who you are, but who you were supposed to be, it rattles your soul. It makes you question whether the boundaries of your life are as secure as you once believed. Think of all the myths humanity has spun about twins separated at birth, or siblings torn apart by fate only to collide again in strange places. Ancient cultures told of doubles walking the earth, doppelgangers, soul shadows, spirit twins. Some were omens of death, others blessings of balance. But what if those stories were not superstition at all, but fragments of a truth too vast to hold? What if across the countless layers of reality, each of us has a twin somewhere, someone whose existence is threaded so tightly with ours that no distance, not even the chasm between worlds, can sever it? The stranger who calls you their twin is not insane. To them, you are the proof that their world was real. When they touch your hand, trembling, they are not just touching flesh. They are reaching across time, across broken mirrors, begging the universe to admit its mistake. In their tears is the grief of losing you once and the ecstasy of finding you again. And though you may never remember the childhood they recall, some part of you aches with the echo of belonging. Because deep down, we all crave that recognition, that unshakable certainty that we are not alone. Maybe that is the cruelest truth hidden in this story, that sometimes the people who know us best are not from here at all, that our reflections, our shattered twins, walk parallel lives, carrying half of who we are. And once in a while, by accident or by design, those halves collide, and the illusion of separation breaks. Whether you accept it or deny it, something inside you has already shifted, because the next time you trace the outline of your scars in the mirror, you might wonder if they are not just marks of your past, but the faint handwriting of a history you shared with someone you no longer remember. And perhaps, somewhere tonight, in another dimension, there is a version of you who is staring at their own reflection, asking the same question. Who have I lost, and when will they return? The street musician. You drop a coin into a guitar case, a small act, almost thoughtless. You were passing by, perhaps in a hurry, perhaps distracted, when a street musician caught your attention. His hands trembled slightly as he played, his clothes worn, his voice raw, his guitar out of tune. He was playing for survival, not for applause. And you, moved by something you couldn't even name, offered him a coin. Just one coin. Then you walked on, never thinking of him again. But in another world, beyond the reach of your imagination, that coin became the spark of a revolution. Picture it. That single gesture gave him enough to eat that night, enough strength to pick up the guitar again tomorrow. He played another day, and another, until the right listener stopped to hear him. A poet, a dreamer, a rebel with eyes set on changing the world. They carried his song like fire. They sang it in dark taverns, in alleys where whispers turned into movements, in gatherings where the oppressed finally remembered their voices. The melody you unknowingly preserved became an anthem, and one day, thousands of people marched to its rhythm, their voices rising in unison, shaking the foundations of the powers that ruled over them. Kingdoms fell, chains broke, a future shifted because you reached into your pocket and chose not to walk past. Doesn't that terrify you? Doesn't it thrill you? That your smallest decision could echo into eternity? That your casual kindness, forgotten almost instantly by you, might be immortalized in the bones of another world? We often think of revolutions as great fires, sparked by great men. But history, even in our own world, is filled with accidents and overlooked gestures. A coin in a guitar case, a page of a book left behind, a word whispered in defiance. They ripple outward in ways we cannot see, and sometimes those ripples grow into storms. Think about music itself. Throughout human history, songs have toppled empires and rebuilt identities. Protest songs in the fields of slavery became hymns of resilience. Folk songs whispered in war-torn countries became shields of defiance. An anthem sung by the powerless becomes the one thing the powerful cannot silence. And in another world, your coin sustains such a song. Without you, perhaps it would have died in the throat of a starving man. With you, it lived, and through it, countless others found their voice. This is the paradox of influence. We think greatness belongs to the chosen few, but the truth is, it often belongs to the nameless many who never even realize what they set into motion. You never wrote the anthem. You never marched in the protests. You never felt the tear gas sting your eyes, but you made it possible. You fed the spark. And in some quiet, secret way, you are as responsible for the revolution as the one who sang the words. And here is the darker reflection. How many songs have been silenced because the world walked past? How many revolutions never bloomed because the dreamer starved, because no one dropped a coin, because no one stopped to listen? History is not only shaped by what we do, it is equally shaped by what we fail to do. That thought should haunt us. Every face we ignore, every voice we dismiss, every fragile spark left unattended. It may be the world we refuse to create, but in this story, you did not walk past. You gave. And though you will never know it, though no statue will ever bear your name, the echoes of your choice carried further than any monument could. The street musician played on, his song spread like fire, and one day, in another universe, your single coin was remembered not as currency, but as the seed of freedom. So, what does this mean for you, here, now? It means you matter. It means that the smallest kindness, the simplest act, can weave into destinies you will never see. You are more powerful than you think, more present in the lives of strangers than you realize. Every gesture, every smile, every word, every coin has the potential to alter futures far beyond your own. The question is, how many of those futures will you choose to nurture? How many forgotten revolutions wait in the shadow of your indifference? And maybe this is the true revolution. Not the overthrow of kings, not the collapse of governments, but the awakening of ordinary people to the weight of their smallest choices. The knowledge that even nameless passers-by shape history. That even a stranger's coin can become a song, and a song can become a banner, and a banner can lead a people into the light. You will never know the names of those who marched under the anthem you made possible, but in their chants, in their victory, in the freedom they claimed, you are immortal. Not remembered, not praised, but present. The revolution would not have been the same without you, and though the world you live in may never feel that echo, somewhere in the vast web of existence, a song carries your fingerprint. A nameless musician strums, a crowd roars, a regime falls, and all of it, every note, every voice, began with you, the seed planter. There are moments in life so small they slip through your fingers like dust, tiny exchanges you barely register, gestures you forget before nightfall. Yet sometimes, those moments echo elsewhere, growing roots where you cannot see them. This is the story of the seed planter. You did not think much of it at the time. You pressed a few seeds into the palm of a stranger's hand, perhaps at a market, perhaps along a dusty road, perhaps with nothing more than a passing smile. They thanked you politely. You walked away. And in this world, nothing changed. But somewhere else, somewhere parallel, the seeds did not remain seeds. They became forests. They became rivers redirected by roots. They became civilizations carved by wood and shade. They became history rewritten because you, absent-mindedly, once gave life away. Imagine the weight of that realization, that your smallest kindness could tilt entire worlds. In our own life, we dismiss such acts as trivial. We drop coins in jars, hold doors open, hand someone a cutting from our garden. We forget. Yet, in another life, in another earth where timelines bend differently, that stranger may have cherished what you gave them as if it were sacred. They may have planted those seeds in soil that never knew trees, in land aching for green. And the world responded. Shade fell where there had been drought. Birds returned with songs that had no place in silence. Rivers slowed, softened, bent their courses beneath new roots. Crops grew where famine had reigned. And from these forests rose cultures that never existed here. History on that earth took a different shape. Kingdoms formed not around stone fortresses, but beneath canopies of living trees. Wars were fought not over borders, but over who controlled the sacred groves. Poetry was carved not in marble, but sung in the language of rustling leaves. Children were taught to count by tracing rings in bark, to measure time by the blooming of flowers. Entire religions grew out of the myth of the first stranger who carried seeds from another place, who handed them away as if handing away the breath of life itself. They built temples of wood, cathedrals of branches, and cities where the streets curved like roots rather than cutting like blades. They saw the forest as not just shelter, but memory itself, each tree a witness to ages unfolding, and you, without knowing, were their myth. They remembered your gesture, they remembered the touch of your hand, they wrote your likeness into tapestries, even if it did not resemble you exactly. Perhaps you became a god in their songs, or a spirit who walked out of storms carrying the gift of green. Perhaps your name was lost, but the story survived. That once a stranger gave us the seeds of our world. What if that is true of us too? What if our own earth is the result of some forgotten exchange in another timeline? Perhaps fire was given not as discovery, but as gift. And perhaps music too was planted like a seed in one wandering soul who then carried it into our nights. We imagine invention as linear, as the triumph of individuals. But what if much of it is the echo of kindnesses from elsewhere, seeds carried across borders of time and reality? This thought unsettles, yet it liberates. It means no act is meaningless. The smallest gesture may echo far beyond its soil. A single word of encouragement could ripple into generations that remember it as prophecy. A single book shared may ignite entire revolutions in a parallel place. A seed slipped into a stranger's hand could become the forest that alters history. Perhaps you've already done it. Perhaps you've smiled at someone who was on the edge of surrender. Perhaps you've given away something you did not think you could spare. Perhaps you've dropped a sentence in conversation that seemed to vanish. Yet, in another world, it grew into the foundation of new philosophy. We rarely know the consequences of what we plant. Most of the time, we are blind gardeners scattering grains into soil we will never touch again. But somewhere, elsewhere, those seeds grow. Somewhere a forest bears your fingerprints, and entire lives are lived in the shade of your generosity. Somewhere, a child walks through groves singing songs that would never exist had you not let something small slip through your hand. And that is the haunting beauty of the seed planter. You will never know what forests you have already grown. You will never hear the songs sung in your honor. You will never walk beneath the branches that bent because of you. But the trees stand. The rivers bend. The history rewrites itself quietly, waiting for someone to remember that all of it began when a stranger, without knowing, placed seeds into another stranger's hand. So the next time you think your gesture too small to matter, remember this. Worlds may be waiting for your smallest kindness. Forests may already be growing in the dark, their roots twisting through the walls between realities. And someday, when another version of you dreams of walking beneath impossible trees, you may feel it. The breath of leaves that owe their existence to the moment you gave life away. The Lighthouse Keeper. They called him the Lighthouse Keeper, though most never knew his name. He was the silhouette that stood watch in the tower's glow, the man who turned storms into signals, the one who burned through sleepless nights so that strangers at sea might live. And yet, his story did not begin with duty or destiny. It began with something far smaller, far more fragile, a smile, a fleeting kindness, given to him one storm-racked evening by someone passing through. You might have forgotten it the moment it left your lips, but for him, it became an anchor, a single gesture that steadied him in the kind of nights where even the strongest men might falter. Picture the lighthouse, its stone walls shuddering as waves crashed against the cliffs, winds howling like the cries of the drowned, oil lamps rattling in their glass, the flame itself trembling, threatening to die. Alone in that tower, the keeper's arms ached from winding the heavy mechanisms. His eyes stung from smoke and salt, and exhaustion whispered that he should surrender. Why fight the storm? Why battle the sea? And then he remembered. That smile, that warmth, that unspoken reminder that even in the bleakest nights, a glimmer of light could change everything. And so, he rose, gripping the lantern wheel with renewed strength, forcing the beacon to cut through the blackness. Ships that would have been lost saw the beam, turned their course, and lived. Hundreds of sailors owed their lives to a moment you never even realized you gave. It's strange, isn't it? How something so small can become the fulcrum of another person's world. You gave no speech, you offered no grand act of courage, only a simple kindness, perhaps tossed into the night like a coin into the sea. But the keeper caught it. He clung to it as though it were a lifeline, and in doing so, he lit the way for others who would never know your name, never see your face, never realize that the reason they returned home safely was because you once chose to share your light, however briefly. The storms did not grow gentler, the sea did not grow kind, but the keeper did not break. With every ship that passed, with every horn that sounded in thanks, he felt the ripple of that one gesture echoing outward. He told himself that as long as he could keep the light alive, someone somewhere might offer another smile to another weary soul, and the cycle would continue. The beacon was not just fire, it was memory. It was proof that even the smallest spark of humanity could push back an ocean of darkness. But here lies the haunting question. How many times have we underestimated the weight of our smallest actions? How often have we assumed that a word of kindness, a glance of warmth, is nothing more than air passing our lips, eyes meeting, and then moving on? We think the world turns on grand inventions, revolutions, wars, and yet, history is littered with unseen keepers. Men and women who endured because of one unnoticed kindness, and who, in turn, preserved countless lives. The smile you gave was not simply a gesture. It was a chain of survival, stretching far beyond the storm, reaching ships you'll never sail, people you'll never meet. Consider your own life. Think of the moments when despair pressed in, when you felt the storm rising, and something small, a friend's word, a stranger's kindness, a fleeting sign, gave you the strength to endure. Did they know what they gave you? Did they understand that their light carried you through? And if not, how many people have you unknowingly carried with your own light, without ever realizing? Each of us, in ways we may never see, becomes the lighthouse keeper for another, sometimes without knowing, sometimes without meaning to. The keeper's tower eventually fell silent. Time weathered its stones, the sea claimed the cliffs, and the lamp grew cold. But his story did not fade. Sailors whispered of a man who lit storms away, who stood against the ocean not because he was unafraid, but because he remembered one human gesture when everything else told him to give up. They say he still walks the coast on certain nights, a ghostly figure tending a light that no longer burns, his strength still rooted in a smile that crossed lifetimes. And in a way, he walks within us all. For every time we hold back from cruelty, every time we offer kindness without expectation, we place another lamp in another tower, somewhere beyond our sight. So when the storm howls in your own life, when you feel the weight of waves crashing, when the flame inside you flickers, Remember this. A single smile can carry across oceans. A single kindness can light a tower strong enough to outshine the darkest night. You may never see the ships you save. You may never know the lives your gesture preserves. But someone will. And they will remember you as their unseen keeper. And the next time you pass by someone in the storm of their own making, give them that light. Offer it, not because it seems grand, but because it seems small. Because the smallest things, as the Lighthouse Keeper's story proves, can ripple outward into eternity. The arcade rival, picture the glow of an arcade on a Friday night, screens flashing like neon-stained glass, coins clinking, laughter tangled with the sound of digital explosions. You step up to a machine almost casually, hands loose, mind drifting. Maybe it was just a way to kill a few minutes. Maybe you didn't even care about winning. But somewhere in the crowd, a stranger was watching. They didn't expect you to challenge them. They didn't expect you to win. And when you did, quickly, effortlessly, as if the game had always belonged to you, it carved something deep inside them, something that would not heal in this timeline, or perhaps in any. For you, it was a moment already forgotten, a flash of movement and a score on a screen. For them, it became the seed of obsession. To lose is one thing, but to lose so fast, so easily, to someone who walked away without even savoring the victory, that is unbearable. It rattles the soul. And in another branch of reality, that humiliation became a crucible. That stranger, still burning with the sting of defeat, returned the next night, and the next after that. Coins poured like prayers into machines. Hours bled into dawn. Every move you made that crushed them replayed endlessly in their mind until it became a script they had to unravel. At first, they tried to imitate you, mimicking the strategies you used, the rhythm of your hands, the timing of your decisions, but imitation is only a shadow, and shadows never win. So they dug deeper, beyond mimicry, into mastery. They studied not just the game, but its architecture, the way the code bent probability, the pattern of enemies, the hidden mathematics beneath the flashing lights. Slowly, painfully, their obsession transformed. What was once humiliation became hunger. What was once rivalry became purpose. In this other timeline, the arcade itself became their temple. They stopped hearing the chatter around them, stopped noticing the smell of popcorn and dust. Their world reduced to the glow of the screen, their heartbeat synchronized with the game's pulse. People gathered to watch, whispering about the figure who seemed less like a player and more like a machine in human skin. And still, behind every level they cleared, every record they shattered, lingered the ghost of you. The stranger who had beaten them so casually, so quickly, that their entire identity bent toward revenge. Think about how strange that is. A moment so small you barely remember it. Yet, in another world, it detonates into destiny. It is the butterfly effect of rivalry, the way a flicker of competition can ignite a fire that burns for a lifetime. History itself is full of these stories. Warriors training in secret after a single loss, poets rewriting verses after being dismissed, scientists driven to invention by the shadow of someone else's success. The greatest masters are not always born from victory. They are born from the unbearable weight of defeat. So, the stranger became a legend, their name etched into the high scores of every arcade they touched, then into tournaments, then into championships. People whispered of their skill as something impossible, almost supernatural. They played with the precision of someone haunted, someone who had folded their entire existence into the logic of a single game. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the crowd's applause faded and the machine's power down, their thoughts returned to you, the faceless rival who started it all, the ghost they could never challenge again. And here, in your world, you never knew. To you, it was nothing. A casual victory, a shrug, a forgotten night. But to them, it was everything. That is the terrifying beauty of parallel lives. Our smallest actions, the gestures we dismiss, can ignite revolutions in someone else's universe. You became their origin story without ever realizing it. You created a legend without meaning to, and perhaps, if the veil between timelines were thinner, you would meet them again. Maybe they would stand before you, not as the humiliated stranger you once defeated, but as the master who surpassed even the game itself. Would you recognize the fire in their eyes? Would you remember that fleeting match? Or would you be bewildered, wondering why this stranger looked at you with both reverence and rage? The truth is this: we are all someone's rival, whether we know it or not. Every passing moment can plant the seed of obsession in another life. And in the hidden corridors of reality, there are rivals sharpening their craft, becoming legends, all because of a defeat we barely recall. You may never meet them again. But somewhere, in the glow of another world's arcade, your quick victory is still playing out, echoing endlessly, shaping the destiny of the rival who refused to forget. The Forgotten Scribe. You once left a note behind. Perhaps it was nothing more than a scrap of paper, scribbled in haste, folded and forgotten. Perhaps it was a line of poetry you jotted down in the margin of a notebook, or a thought you couldn't contain that spilled onto the corner of a page. Perhaps it was never even meant for anyone else's eyes, a fragment of your mind cast aside like ash. But in another version of history, in another thread of the universe, that note was not forgotten. It was found. It was carried. And in time, it became a sacred text. Imagine a world where your idle words are preserved not as a whisper, but as a doctrine. A traveler centuries ago stumbles upon the faded ink. They see meaning in your lines, meaning you never intended. To you, it was only a fleeting thought. To them, it was revelation. They share it with another, and that other carries it further. Soon it is copied by hand, etched into parchment, guarded by scribes who believe they are protecting the words of the divine. And over generations, your note grows into a scripture. It is sung in temples. It is carved into stone. It is taught to children who will never know that the author, this forgotten scribe, was only you in another life, writing absent-mindedly, unaware of the weight your words would carry. This is the paradox of language. Words are fragile, but also indestructible. They leap beyond intention, beyond context, beyond even truth. They outlive their author, reshape themselves in the mouths of others, gain power not from what you meant, but from what others hear. History is full of examples. A letter meant for one person becomes the seed of philosophy. A diary no one was meant to read becomes the chronicle of an entire era. A speech improvised in desperation becomes the anthem of a people. And in that other world, your forgotten note became the compass by which civilizations navigated meaning. But think about what this reveals. How careless we are with the fragments we leave behind. Every sentence, every scribble, every half-thought can become immortal if preserved in the right moment. The most ordinary ink can be transformed into sacred fire when others choose to believe in it. And once belief takes root, it grows beyond control. A line written in passing, "All things are temporary," or "Light comes after darkness," may become law, ritual, commandment. Entire wars may one day be fought over what you never even intended to say. And that is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. That your private thought could someday move armies, build temples, and bend history. Consider our own world. How many words have survived because someone thought to keep them? How many fragments have we mistaken for prophecy? The Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of letters hidden in clay jars, carried across millennia. The epics of Homer, stitched together from oral memory, perhaps never written by a single hand at all. The words of mystics, monks, poets, etched into walls and carried as scripture by those who believed. And how many others were lost, burned, drowned, erased, leaving behind only silence? In another version of history, your note was not lost. It endured. And because it endured, it reshaped everything. This is what it means to be a forgotten scribe. You are not remembered, but your words are. You are erased from the story, but your lines remain. They are detached from you, no longer yours, carried into eternity by strangers who will never know your name. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. You may have written your note in loneliness, convinced no one would ever care. But centuries later, your forgotten sentence became the axis upon which the faith of millions turned. So what does this mean for you, here now? It means that nothing you create is ever truly insignificant. Every word you release into the world carries the possibility of eternity. The letter you never send, the message you post online, the journal you abandon in a drawer, any one of them may be rediscovered and reimagined. You do not control how the world will read you. You only choose whether or not to write. And that choice, though it feels small, may be the seed of something far greater than you. And here is the haunting question. If one of your forgotten notes became a sacred text, what would it say about you? Would it guide with wisdom or mislead with misunderstanding? Would it be remembered as truth or wielded as weapon? Because words, once released, do not belong to us anymore. They belong to the world. They belong to history. And history has a way of turning even the smallest fragments into monuments. So perhaps this is the quiet responsibility of every writer, every speaker, every thinker. To know that the simplest sentence might outlive you. To know that what you consider disposable may one day become holy. And in that sense, we are all forgotten scribes. We are all leaving fragments behind for someone, somewhere to discover. Fragments that may carry more power than we ever imagined. And when you are long gone, when your name is dust and your story erased, your words may still be here. A child may whisper them as a prayer. A leader may proclaim them as law. A stranger may carry them as hope. And though you will never know it, though you will never hear their voices, they will all be speaking your memory. Not your name, but your echo. The forgotten scribe becomes immortal, not through fame, not through monuments, but through the endurance of words. And in another world, that scribe was you. You left a note behind, and it became scripture. The Grieving Widow. There are people who carry silence like a wound, quiet souls who move through streets and markets with eyes that never rise too high, as if the sky itself has betrayed them. She was one of them, the Grieving Widow. To others, she was only another face blurred in the passing crowd, another shadow crossing the pavement. But to herself, she carried a story heavy enough to bend her spine, a loss that pressed against her chest with every breath. Her world had ended in the absence of one man, and yet the days kept coming, relentless and cruel. One evening, exhausted by the weight of memory, she lifted her gaze for only a moment, and there, you passed. A stranger, your face softened by the falling light, your glance unintentional, almost careless. Yet to her, it was not careless. It was recognition. In the briefest flicker of your eyes, she saw her partner again, the curve of expression, the rhythm of presence, something indescribable that lit a dying ember in her chest. You did not stop. You did not speak. You did not know. But she carried that fragment home as if it were gold. That night, when the silence of her empty bed pressed down like a suffocating tide, she held on to that glance. She replayed it the way some people replay old songs, clinging to the fragments of a melody that once gave them life. She remembered how, just for a heartbeat, the world had felt whole again, as though time had cracked and let her lost partner's memory slip through into her present. And with that fragile thread, she endured. She told herself, if the world is kind enough to give me this illusion once, perhaps it will again. Perhaps I can last one more night. In truth, so many survivors live like this. They are not kept alive by miracles or grand revelations, but by tiny splinters of humanity, a stranger's smile, a laugh overheard, a glance that awakens a buried memory. Grief makes the world appear barren, stripped of meaning. Yet, within that desert, even the faintest bloom is enough to keep a soul moving forward. You gave her that bloom without knowing. You became her accidental lifeline, her quiet proof that the world still contained echoes of love. Psychologists say memory is not fixed. It reshapes itself each time we recall it. And maybe that is why your glance mattered so much. Her mind braided your presence into the fabric of her partner's memory, softening the jagged edges of loss. To others, it might seem like a trick of the brain, but to her, it was grace. It was survival. That one fleeting moment became a lantern she could relight every night the shadows threatened to consume her. Think of the enormity of this. You, without intention, carried someone through their darkest hours. A gesture so small it barely touched your own awareness became, to another soul, the difference between despair and endurance. You will never know the full gravity of that glance. She will never be able to tell you. Yet, its weight remains. A quiet ripple in the unseen ocean of lives we touch without meaning to. And perhaps this is how love survives death. Not in thunderous miracles, but in the fragments that strangers unknowingly carry forward. A familiar glance, a tone of voice, a silhouette caught in passing light. Little reminders that the world does not erase, it only scatters, leaving us to stumble upon pieces of those we have lost, hidden inside others. So, if one day without reason you feel the weight of someone's eyes linger on you longer than usual, remember, You may have just reminded them of someone they are still learning how to live without. You may have given them a memory strong enough to carry through another night. You may have become their proof that love never truly leaves. It only changes shape, waiting to be recognized in the glance of a stranger. The Wanderer Monk. Imagine a dimly lit monastery chamber, incense curling through the air, candles flickering against ancient stone. A monk sits in stillness, lost in his breath, dissolving into silence. His mind has walked these quiet paths for decades, circling the same practices, the same scriptures, the same boundaries of thought. And then, one day you spoke. Perhaps it was not profound to you. Perhaps it was just a question that slipped from your lips, as fragile as a whisper. What is silence, if not a sound too vast for us to hear? The monk's meditation shifted. His breath caught. His stillness trembled, because in that question was not noise, but a door. It unsettled him because silence, what he thought he knew, what he thought he practiced, was suddenly no longer absence, but presence, a vastness, something alive. And when he returned to meditation the next morning, he carried your question like a seed lodged in the folds of his mind. His breath felt different. The quiet he once entered felt like a sky expanding instead of a wall enclosing. He began to speak of it, softly, cautiously, to those around him. Other monks listened, some resisted fiercely, but some felt it too. They tried to meditate on silence, not as emptiness, but as fullness, not as absence of sound, but as the sound of everything together, layered beyond perception. From there, a new philosophy was born. One monastery carried it to another. Scrolls were written. Debates began. Some called it dangerous, too unorthodox, too destabilizing, but others called it revelation. And within a generation, entire schools of thought shifted, rooted in a single question you asked and then forgot. Think of it, philosophies that shape nations often begin with moments like these. Socrates asking questions in Athens, the Buddha speaking under the Bodhi tree, Lao Tzu pondering the nature of the Tao. They were not always delivering answers. More often, they were planting questions that refused to die, questions that echoed through the minds of those who heard them until they reshaped the way entire civilizations understood themselves. Your question about silence joined this lineage, though you never knew. And isn't that the mystery of influence? We imagine our words vanish the moment they leave our lips, but sometimes they continue, carried forward by those whose lives we briefly touched. You may never know it, but a whole generation of monks may have shifted their practice because of you. Their chants altered, their breath deepened, their philosophy expanded, all because you dared to ask what silence really was. And from their teachings, thousands more were born, carrying forward a philosophy that spread across valleys, across mountains, across centuries. But here lies the paradox. If silence is altered by a single question, was it ever silence at all? Or is silence something dynamic, forever reshaped by every attempt to name it, every effort to understand it? Perhaps your question revealed the deeper truth, that silence is not static, but relational. It is not only what remains when sound ends, but also the space where thought collides with stillness, where language falls apart, and yet something is heard. And perhaps this is why your words mattered so much. Because to those who had meditated for lifetimes, you offered a fracture in the familiar. They had treated silence as the end. You showed them it could also be a beginning. And in that shift, whole philosophies took root, ones that will outlast stone walls, wooden prayer beads, and the turning of centuries. Now, ask yourself, how many times in your own life have you spoken lightly, only to find your words lingering in someone else's mind far longer than you intended? How many silent revolutions began with a question no one meant to ask? The Wanderer Monk carried yours into the heart of his meditation, and from him, it spread into countless monasteries elsewhere. And perhaps, even now, monks you will never meet are sitting in silence, not as emptiness, but as fullness, as a sound too vast for them to hear because of you. The Oracle's visitor. They called you the Oracle's visitor, though you arrived with nothing more sacred than curiosity. No offerings, no vows, only a question that tugged at the hem of your thoughts for years. In another strand of the world, down a road that does not exist here, you climbed worn stone steps toward a chamber of smoke and whisper, expecting only echoes. You asked quietly, almost apologetically, as if your wondering might disturb the dust. The priestesses listened. The scribe lifted his reed. The oracle's breath dimmed the flame, and, for a moment, the room felt like a lung inhaling the city. No one expected your question to travel, but sound slipped into clay. The scribe pressed marks while the attendants repeated your syllables until they tasted like ritual. By noon, runners carried your wondering to gates and granaries. By dusk, a shepherd turned his flock because a rumor said your words meant wolves would hunt lower valleys. By midnight, a king recalculated his borders. What had you done except ask? Yet in that strand, the asking was enough. The oracle's attendants called it fate. The soldiers called it orders. The mothers called it warning. And you, who had only wanted to understand, watched a city adjust itself around your curiosity as if a hinge had been thrown in the world. At first, the changes felt merciful. A river crossing closed on a moonless night because your question contained the phrase, dark water. Sailors returned early. A storm took the route they would have sailed. A wedding was postponed when an elder muttered that your wondering mentioned eclipse. The bride later laughed that the delay saved her from a life she didn't want. Small mercies multiplied. The question became a talisman against arrogance, a permission slip for caution. You tasted relief and fear in the same breath. Relief that words could save, fear that words could rule. Power that arrives by accident is still power, and soon the city sharpened you. Courtiers wrote commentaries around syllables you barely remembered saying. A general wrapped your phrasing around his plan like a banner and marched into the valleys believing he had tamed fate. When he won, he thanked the oracle for revealing what was always already in his heart. When he lost, his soldiers blamed your ambiguity. They wanted prophecy to be a blade, not a mirror, and they swung it accordingly. Do you know the feeling of being misquoted by the future? In that strand, you learned it intimately. You saw a dockyard shutter at noon because a clerk cited your syllables. You saw a healer's clinic flood with parents after rumors spread that your question implied a sickness carried by birds. You heard your own voice read back in a cadence that made it sound inevitable. And through it all, the oracle simply breathed. She did not print your future. She printed your influence. What people did with it was their own invention, but they insisted it was yours. They wanted cause where there was only catalyst. They wanted a blueprint where there had only been a doorway. One evening, a woman approached you with eyes like storms that hadn't yet decided whether to break. She thanked you for saving her son. Your question had convinced a garrison to delay conscription. He found work at the mill instead, she said, and the month became a year, and the year became his life. Another day, a traitor spat at your feet. Your words had convinced a council to levy a tariff, and his ships rotted at anchor while rivals prospered. You traded my future for your curiosity, he hissed. Both were telling the truth. That was the terror of it. That was the grace. There were kings, too, who leaned on your syllables like crutches. One canceled a coronation, believing your wondering meant he should walk among the markets first. Another passed a law against hoarding grain because your phrasing lingered on hunger. Across the river, a rival called you a fraud. He staged bonfires of copied tablets, but in the morning his people still whispered your question, as softly as prayer, as loudly as rumor. But power's shadow is fear, and fear demands victims. When the harvest failed, because rain is still rain and soil still stubborn, the blame returned to your mouth. Crowds wanted a villain precise enough to stone and vague enough to reuse. Lovers who had once postponed their wedding by your syllables demanded to know why you hadn't warned them of frost. You understood then that prophecy is not an answer. It is a redistribution of responsibility, a way for the city to outsource its dread. So, you went back to the stairs and the smoke and the silence. You asked the oracle how to undo what had been done. She smiled, the kind of smile that knows the difference between doors and windows. You cannot unsay wonder, she said. You can only say it better. She placed a lamp in your hands, a bowl of oil, a wick, a modest flame, and told you to carry it through the streets. This is a question shaped like light. Walk with it. Let people see you keep it. When they ask what it means, say you do not know yet, but you are learning to be responsible for the glow. And so you walked. Through markets, through fields, through nights when shadows begged to swallow it. Slowly the city shifted. The king stopped speaking of omens and started speaking of outcomes. Soldiers folded maps and listened to farmers describe mud. Mothers tied amulets not for protection, but as reminders to wash, to teach, to be gentle. And you, once an accidental hinge of destiny, became a steward of something smaller, slower, truer. A light that traveled not as command, but as companionship. Years later, your words still lived, but softened, worn by hands and retellings. Children practiced reading on them. Elders shook their heads at how belief once bent a city around one stranger's wondering, and yet they kept the story because they knew that in another strand it could happen again. Even here, even now, the next question you ask will not be a spell, but it will be a seed. Speak it carefully. Carry it like a lamp. Somewhere, a king will hear it and pause before arrogance. Somewhere, a commoner will hear it and step forward into a waiting life. Somewhere, a child will remember that curiosity itself can shape the future, if only because others believe it can. The bridge builder. It began as nothing. A plank of wood, heavier than you expected, awkward in your hands as you helped a stranger lift it from the mud. You didn't think twice. It was a passing moment, a small courtesy, the kind of gesture that dissolves in memory before the day is even done. But in another world, that moment was not small. In that world, it was the first stone of a foundation, the spark that would one day ignite the unthinkable. Two divided lands, long fractured by hatred and silence, would find their way across a bridge that began with your hands. Imagine it, a border where rivers had been walls for generations, where people stood on opposite banks like wary animals, watching, mistrusting, waiting for one another to slip. Trade had rotted into theft, words had sharpened into weapons, and no one remembered who started the feud, only that it had lasted too long to ever end. In that other world, one man tried anyway. He began with scraps of wood, stolen hours, a dream too heavy for his shoulders. He could not carry it alone. And when you by chance passed him struggling and bent your back to lift a plank, it changed everything. Because now he wasn't building alone. Now the vision had proof. Even across divides, one person could choose to help. That single gesture became the seed of legend. Others saw it or heard of it, and though suspicions still clung to their tongues, something began to shift. What if the river could be crossed without blood? What if the chasm was not a curse, but an invitation? Slowly, plank by plank, the bridge rose, not just from timber and rope, but from a new kind of faith. And when the day came that the two sides met in the middle, standing on boards that no one believed would ever hold, it was not just a structure of wood. It was a structure of memory, built on the day you lent your strength. Do you see how terrifying that is? That in one version of reality, your gesture meant nothing. A plank lifted, a stranger thanked, and life went on unchanged. But in another, that same gesture bent the course of history. That is the secret weight of our smallest acts. They carry futures we will never see. One nail hammered can echo into centuries. One hand extended can mend nations. The bridge of another world was not born of treaties or armies, but of an ordinary kindness, unnoticed in this one. Think of how often history has turned on such fragile hinges. A letter delivered on the right day prevented a war. A cup of water offered to an enemy birthed a peace treaty. A farmer sparing a traveler's life changed the line of kings. These are not grand gestures. They are small ones, but in the right soil, they grow vast. That is the truth hidden in the myth of the bridge builder, that the difference between fracture and union is not always power, but participation. A plank lifted, a burden shared. The irony is that you may never feel the weight of it. In your world, you forgot. In that world, they remembered. Children would grow hearing stories of the nameless helper, the one who made the bridge possible. Poets would weave verses about the first plank lifted together, the moment that proved no hand was too small to start a monument. And though your name blurred with time, the story never did. It became a lesson carved into the very wood of that bridge. Every crossing, a reminder that unity began not with nations, but with two strangers and one act of strength. What does this say about us? About you? That your life may be heavier than you think. That the gestures you consider fleeting may be immortal somewhere else. That another version of you, lifting the same plank, became the hinge upon which worlds turned. And if that is true, if such power sleeps in the smallest kindness, then perhaps this world too is waiting for its bridge. Perhaps the divides that cut through our lives are not permanent walls, but rivers awaiting hands bold enough to begin. Tomorrow, you may hold a door, share a word, lift a burden. It may feel like nothing, but maybe somewhere beyond your sky, it is the beginning of a bridge. And maybe, centuries from now, two sides that swore they could never meet will stand together and walk across. Because in another world, you once lifted a plank, and that was enough. The Astral Painter. You didn't mean to become a subject. You were only passing the open door of her studio, following a corridor lit by late afternoon when the sun threw your outline across a wall of blank canvas. A soft silhouette. Nothing more. She looked up from the mess of brushes and solvents and saw your shadow pin itself to the grain of linen like a moth. It wasn't your face that caught her. It was the contour of a presence without identity, the geometry of a life reduced to a dark shape. She didn't call out. She held her breath, as if a bird had landed in the room and waited for the moment to decide itself. Your shadow stayed, quivering at the edges, and in that tremor she felt the beginning of a language. Not portrait, not landscape, not still life. Something else. A new grammar of absence and ache. The first strokes were tentative. She mixed black not from a tube, but from the patient marriage of ultramarine, burnt umber, and a breath of alizarin. Because true darkness, she believed, should be made, not bought. She mapped the boundary where you're not quite you met the light, then let the interior remain unspoken. The canvas drank the night she offered it. Your outline became a vessel, a wound in the surface where the world might leak through. She worked with a steadiness that had eluded her for years, a quiet certainty that this, at last, was the door she had been trying to walk through and could never find the handle to. She painted until the sun slid away and your shadow dissolved. But by then, the shape had entered her, and she no longer needed the corridor. She named nothing. Names would have turned the work into biography, and biography would have shrunk the mystery. Instead, she let the piece speak in its own weather. A horizon of ash, a worked field of gray, the tender flare of a single brush hair caught in dried paint like a fossilized pulse. When she stepped back, the room felt larger, as if the wall had opened into another country. It was only a silhouette, and yet it seemed to hold all the rooms you had ever walked through and all the ones you would never see. The first canvas was followed by a second, a third, and then an avalanche. Each one searched for the moment before identity, the hinge where presence becomes name, where a person becomes a story. The critics would later call the movement radical, but to her it was simply honest, a refusal to pretend that faces are the truth of us. In another world, the paintings might have stayed in a damp studio, stacked like neglected doors. But a gallery assistant, half bored and half curious, wandered in on a rain-heavy afternoon and felt, at a distance of 20 feet, the sensation of being watched by something that did not have eyes. He bought one with his own money. Then, a poet wrote about it. Then a musician used the image on a record sleeve, and a protest group carried a screen-printed version like a banner through streets full of sirens. She woke one morning to find the silhouette projected up the side of a government building, a midnight mural defying floodlights. Your shadow, which had once trembled at the edge of a corridor, had learned to loom. The idea became a contagion of courage. People who had never been seen found themselves in the dark space's generosity. The paintings made room for those who lacked papers, lacked permission, lacked the right surname, or the right body to be welcomed. The silhouette insisted. Even without a face, a person is undeniable. Even without a resume, a soul has weight. In classrooms, teachers used reproductions to talk about the ethics of looking. In courtrooms, lawyers argued that the anonymous are not the faceless. That policy should be humane to those who wear the world's erasures. In bedrooms, teenagers traced the outline with their fingertips and wrote private vows to become visible on their own terms. The movement did not make saints. It made witnesses. But fame is a weather that changes the shape of anything that stands in it. Galleries multiplied. Money arrived with its polite knives. Curators, eager to catalog what resists cataloging, assembled walls of statements explaining the work until the silence that made it powerful began to feel crowded. She resisted, and then she relented, and then she resisted again. Through it all, the shape remained. Your shape. The refusal carved into paint. Late at night, when the committee lights had gone out and the guard's footsteps drifted away, she would return to the studio and do what she had done the first day. Mix darkness by hand and outline a presence that refused biography. Whenever she doubted, she walked to that corridor and waited for the sun to throw another gentle blade across the wall. It never matched the first time. It didn't need to. The first time was no longer an event, it was a compass. She told no one whose shadow it had been. She didn't know. Not really. Your passing had been as ordinary as a sigh. She wondered sometimes what kind of day you were having, whether you were late, whether you were grieving, whether the weight on your shoulders had anything to do with the stoop and the silhouette. She wondered if you ever saw the posters, the murals, the pins on jackets, the tattoos. Did the world feel slightly haunted to you, as if a small, ordinary moment had been stolen and returned as a myth? If you recognized yourself, would you claim it? Or would you let the anonymity continue its work, because names would only domesticate the wildness you had bequeathed? Movements need origin stories, and so the mythologists did what they always do. They invented a beginning sturdy enough to bear the weight of what came after. Some said the figure was a lost lover. Some said it was a migrant who vanished in transit. Some said the artist herself had split from her own body and painted the remainder. The truth, if there had to be one, was simpler and more astonishing. It was a nothing that became a language. It was a shadow, and then it was a door. And when the door opened, people stepped through not into a room, but into the fact of themselves. You might ask what any of this has to do with you, now, listening. Everything. Because you are continually shedding shadows you cannot see. In the metro window at night, when the city drifts over your shoulder like a moving fresco. In the office corridor when you pass the glass of a conference room and leave a soft eclipse on the carpet. In the kitchen, when a lamp turns your profile into a cut paper on the wall. You are always writing in light whether you intend to or not. The question is not whether you will be seen, it is whether the world will learn to look where you are not glaringly present, whether it will honor the negative space, the margins where you have been reduced, simplified, made into a symbol, and treat even that reduction as sacred. The Astral Painter, they came to call her, though she despised the nickname. The astral in her work was never the decorative stars drooling guilt over a night sky. It was the cosmology of nearness and absence, the way a body can be the moon for someone else, tidal in its pull even when unseen. Her canvases taught the eyes a new orbit, not around faces, but around the gravity of what faces cast. Critics kept trying to date the movement's death. Movements, after all, are easier to teach when you can put an end on them. But in small studios across the world, students carried the practice forward, mixing darkness by hand, training their sight not on celebrity, but on the thresholds where people flicker. The curriculum became simple, almost devotional. Attend, outline, protect. Years passed. She aged. The markets turned and turned again. The silhouette, faithful and patient, made a home in museums and alleyways alike. One winter, a retrospective offered a room where every wall bore the same boundary, the edge where a presence refuses to surrender itself to inventory. Visitors stood in silence, their own shadows bending softly onto the floor. Some cried, though nothing in the room asked for tears. Some stood very still as if listening. The guards who had learned the rhythm of the space watched faces loosen and then lift, as if something tight had been quietly untied, and you kept living, mostly unaware. Yet sometimes, in certain lights, you felt a strange companionship, as if a part of you had gone on without you and made a life elsewhere. On nights when the moon was thin enough to be honest, you dreamed of rooms that opened like lungs, of canvases breathing, of hands mixing a night that was kind. You woke with the taste of turpentine at the back of your throat and the soft conviction that somewhere, in the great elsewhere we pretend is separate from us, your absence had learned to do work that your presence never could. This is the secret her paintings taught and your shadow began. That we are larger than our biographies. That what we fail to carry forward with name and narrative may yet step forward without us, cast against the surfaces of other lives, and make a difference. You will not always be recognized. You will not always be credited. But the world is full of thresholds that remember you anyway. Walk past a door at the right hour, and you are part of a movement. Turn your face, and someone learns how to look. Leave behind the shape of your going, and a stranger will find in it the courage to arrive. In the end, there is no end, only accumulation. Rooms of outlines, cities of murals, a generation of painters who learn to trust the eloquence of the nearly not there. Somewhere, a student stands before a blank canvas, waiting for the sun to suggest a subject. Somewhere, an artist mixes black the slow way, honoring the labor of night. Somewhere, a passerby hesitates at the threshold of an open studio, not knowing that their ordinary life is about to become a constellation. and somewhere the Astral Painter looks up as a shadow drifts across her wall and understands again that the masterpiece was never hers alone. It was yours too. It always was, from the moment the light chose you and you kept walking, leaving the world a shape it could finally learn to love. The Forest Healer. There are legends that begin not with kings or wars, but with a quiet walk through the trees. You remember it only as a small act, showing a lost stranger the way out of the woods. You pointed to a path, lit a fire, shared a flask of water. Nothing more. And yet, in another dimension, that single act became the root of something vast, the birth of medicine itself. The forest was thick, the air heavy with damp earth and resin. The stranger you met seemed fragile, overwhelmed by the labyrinth of branches. They leaned on you, their breath unsteady, their eyes filled with the weight of someone who had never trusted the wilderness. You guided them. You broke twigs to mark a trail. You lifted branches aside. You calmed their panic when the night wind twisted through the leaves. To you, it was kindness. To them, it was revelation. They had entered the woods believing it was a place of threat, of hunger, of death. But you showed them that the forest could be a teacher. They noticed how you touched the bark of trees as though listening to them. They watched as you crushed a leaf between your fingers and rubbed its scent into your skin to keep away biting insects. They saw you press a poultice of moss against your own cut hand without hesitation, and watched the bleeding slow. And in their mind, on that parallel earth, something shifted. The woods were not merely shadows hiding predators, they were a library. A vast green archive of cures and poisons, of lessons written in sap and stone. That stranger returned to their people carrying not only survival, but knowledge. They spoke of leaves that cooled fevers, roots that steadied hearts, bark that stopped infection. They built fires where they recited the names of plants like prayers. They taught others to boil, to grind, to heal instead of fear. And from those small beginnings grew the first healers, then the first schools, then entire cities shaped by the pursuit of wellness. Where our earth grew around steel and conquest, theirs grew around medicine. Their statues honored healers, not generals. Their songs praised the hands that cured, not the hands that killed. And all of it began because once, in some forest, you chose to guide a stranger instead of leaving them to be swallowed by the dark. You will never know the weight of that choice, because in this world, the moment was unremarkable, but in theirs, it rewrote history. Generations of children were taught your gesture as myth, the unnamed guide who lit the path, who showed humanity that life could be preserved, not merely endured. It is unsettling to think how easily the balance of a world can tilt on something so quiet. A path pointed out, a leaf crushed between fingers, a hand steadying another in fear. Yet perhaps that is always how history changes, not through thunder, but through whispers. We measure greatness in battles and inventions, but the foundations are laid in moments no one notices at the time. Think of it. How many times have you guided someone without thought, given advice, offered directions, shared something you assumed trivial? How many of those gestures may have seeded whole forests of change in dimensions you will never see? Perhaps every kindness is a medicine. Perhaps every glance of help is a formula that echoes beyond the borders of one reality. The Forest Healer's world reminds us that nothing we give is wasted. Somewhere, someone may be building cathedrals of knowledge out of the scraps you once handed them without knowing their worth. Somewhere, an entire lineage may trace its existence back to your choice not to walk away. And though you will never stand in those cities, never hear those songs, never see the faces healed by that lineage, you are there. Your shadow lives in their hospitals, your hand rests in their books. Your voice echoes in the words they speak when they thank their healers. So the next time you guide someone, the next time you share what little you know, remember, you may be planting the roots of worlds. A stranger's survival may bloom into a civilization's future. And long after your own story is forgotten here, in another dimension, they may still speak of you, not as a ghost, not as a god, but as the quiet guide who led them out of the forest and into the light of healing. The torchbearer. Picture this. A night so dark it feels endless, where the air is heavy and every step forward is swallowed by shadow. Someone is stumbling through it, alone, afraid, convinced that the dark will never end. And then you appear, holding something simple in your hand. A torch. Not a grand fire, not a blazing sun, but a single flame trembling against the void. You offer it to them, perhaps without a word, perhaps without even thinking. To you, it was a gesture so small it seemed almost insignificant. But to them, it was everything. That light pierced their night. It burned away the weight of despair. It reminded them that the dark was not absolute, that even in endless shadows, fire can be carried, warmth can be shared, sight can be regained. They clutched that torch as though it was the heartbeat of the universe itself, as though it had been waiting for them all along. And from that moment on, they were no longer lost. But here is the twist. You never knew what happened next. That torch did not remain only in their hands. They carried it forward. They passed it on. They became the flame bearer to others, and soon the light multiplied. A story was born, told in whispers and chants, in fireside tales and temple songs. The story of the one who gave them light in the deepest dark. Over time, your nameless gesture grew into legend. You became the torchbearer, not as a person, but as a symbol, a reminder that in the bleakest of nights, someone will always hand you hope. Think of how myths begin. They rarely come from gods descending with thunder. More often, they are born from small acts repeated until they shine brighter than history itself. Prometheus stealing fire for mankind. A stranger lighting a candle in a plague-stricken city. A lone wanderer helping a child cross a burning road. At first, it is a single flame. Then it becomes memory. Then it becomes myth. And soon, generations grow up believing in the torchbearer, the one who brings light when it is most needed, whose act of compassion became the architecture of hope. And this is not only metaphor. Across time, humanity has been reshaped by people who carried light into darkness. Think of the nurse tending to soldiers in war, carrying lanterns across the blood-soaked field, Florence Nightingale, remembered forever as the lady with the lamp, or the resistance fighters smuggling scraps of food and warmth to those imprisoned in camps, or even the ordinary stranger who, with a single kind act, shifts the fate of someone standing on the edge. These torches are not always fire. Sometimes they are words, or hands, or reminders that survival is still possible. Now imagine, in another world, the one you touched did not just survive. They told others, and those others retold it until it became scripture, until it became law. Perhaps in some distant monastery, a monk chants your story as prayer. Perhaps in a village across the mountains of imagination, parents tell their children, when the darkness comes, remember, the torchbearer will appear. They may never know your face, your voice, your name, but they know the flame you gave them, because it still burns in their world. This is the hidden truth of influence. The smallest gestures can echo beyond our own lifetimes, beyond even our own reality. You thought you only handed over a flame, but you passed on survival, courage, and a future. Entire bloodlines may thrive because you kept one soul from surrendering to the dark. Entire cultures may anchor their rituals, their festivals, their sense of meaning in a legend that began with you. And what does this mean for us? It means that our every act carries a weight we cannot measure, that kindness is never wasted, even when unseen, that hope, once shared, cannot be contained. It multiplies. Somewhere, right now, someone may be alive, may be building, may be creating, because a stranger handed them light when they thought the dark would consume them. And maybe this is what immortality really looks like. Not statues or monuments, not names carved in stone, but the quiet fire passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart, until it becomes eternal. You were the torchbearer once, and somewhere, in worlds you'll never see, you always will be. The broken engineer, they called him the broken engineer, though it wasn't his machines that fractured. It was him. He lived in another strand of the world, in a city that breathes only in echoes, a place you'll never walk, but that shaped itself around a moment you will never remember. He had been building towers, bridges, engines of steel and fire. His designs stretched higher than his own courage, drawn in fevered lines across parchment, blueprints that burned his nights into sleepless ash. And then one day, in the simplest exchange, someone passed by and made a suggestion. Casual, almost careless, a question about balance, a word about pressure, a reminder of weight. A phrase so ordinary that you might not have noticed saying it, yet for him, it was a revelation. It bent his mind like steel under heat, shifting the arc of everything he had drawn. At first, the engineer resisted. Pride is the heaviest load a man can carry, heavier even than stone. He had dreamed these designs, bled for them, endured mockery and doubt. Why should a stranger's suggestion matter? But it stayed with him, echoing in his skull, tapping at the corners of his drafts like a ghost knocking at a locked door. Finally, he listened. He rechecked the angles, recalculated the stress, reimagined the foundation, and what he found chilled him. His grand bridge, meant to carry thousands, would have collapsed under its own ambition. His towers, meant to scrape the sky, would have buckled in the wind. The city he loved would have been buried beneath his brilliance. And all of it was undone by a suggestion. A word you forgot the instant you said it, but one that rewrote the architecture of his destiny. Imagine that moment. A hand pausing over paper, the ink blotting because the mind behind it suddenly saw everything differently. He tore apart weeks of drafts, rebuilt models from splintered wood and twisted metal, tested and retested until his hands bled from friction and his eyes burned with exhaustion. And when the designs were finally complete, they were humbler, quieter, but enduring. The bridge arched not like a monument, but like a prayer, steady, silent, unyielding. The towers did not scrape the sky, but they stood, generation after generation, unbroken. And because of that one passing word, the city thrived instead of crumbling. But the world does not thank men for disasters avoided. No one built statues for him. No one sang songs about the catastrophe that never came. Instead, the city lived on in ordinary peace, its people walking streets that never collapsed, crossing bridges that never gave way, raising children in homes that never turned to rubble. They never knew that their very existence was balanced on the fulcrum of a stranger's casual thought. They lived because of silence, because of absence, because ruin had been erased before it could be written. And yet, the engineer carried the weight. He knew how close he had come to breaking the world he loved. He knew that brilliance untethered from humility is a blade with no hilt, a weapon turned inward as much as outward. He knew that all it took to turn him from destroyer to builder was one suggestion, one mirror held up by chance, and that knowledge haunted him. It broke him, not because he failed, but because he understood how fragile success truly is. He walked among the streets, hearing laughter and trade and song, and wondered if he deserved their lives. He watched children run across his bridge, watched lovers meet beneath towers that might have buried them, and felt the echo of what almost was. Think of our own lives. How many times has a word, a suggestion, a glance shifted the course of what might have been? A teacher's question that made you doubt, a friend's warning that made you hesitate, a stranger's encouragement that made you step forward instead of back. Whole futures hinge on moments so small we forget them. The City in Echoes proves this, that survival sometimes depends less on strength than on attention, on whether we are humble enough to listen when chance whispers correction into our ears. The broken engineer's story is not one of glory. His name is not etched in stone, his face not remembered. What endures is the city that survived, the generations that thrived, the disaster that never came. His triumph was invisible, his victory quiet. And yet, what could be more powerful? To save lives without applause, to build safety into the very bones of a world, knowing no one will ever thank you because no one will ever know what you prevented. Some say the engineer eventually vanished into his own silence, that the weight of knowing what nearly happened consumed him, that he walked into the foundations of his bridge one evening and became part of the stone itself, forever holding it steady. Others whisper that he still lingers, a shadow at the edge of construction sites, a phantom hand guiding architects away from arrogance, toward humility. But whether myth or memory, his story lingers in us. Every time we double-check a decision, every time we hesitate before pride makes us reckless, every time we let another voice remind us of the fragility beneath our brilliance, we all carry a fragment of the broken engineer, and the City of Echoes stands as proof. The greatest disasters are not the ones we endure, but the ones that vanish before they arrive. So the next time you speak, remember this. Your words may be forgotten by you, but not by the one who hears them. They may be the difference between collapse and endurance, between ruin and survival. They may redraw a world you'll never walk, a city you'll never see, lives you'll never know. A passing suggestion may feel small to you, but in another strand, it might be the bridge that keeps an entire city standing. The signal receiver, It begins with something so small you would never think twice about it. A laugh, rising uninvited in the dark, breaking from your chest like a bird startled into flight. Maybe you were walking home alone. Maybe you were with friends. Maybe you were remembering something too absurd not to laugh at. The night swallowed the sound, or so you thought. But sound has a way of refusing death. It doesn't simply vanish, it travels, bouncing, scattering, echoing into corners you cannot see. And, in another reality, through cracks in the fabric of existence, that laugh did not fade. It was caught, magnified, amplified, until it became a signal, a broadcast. And in that world, someone was listening. Imagine it, a room lit by humming machines, dials glowing like watchful eyes. A figure leans over a receiver, ears straining against static, night after night chasing whispers in the dark. And then, through the noise, it comes. Your laugh. Not words, not music, but a sound so human it makes their hearts stop. In their world, broadcasts from beyond are myth, dreams of a cosmos speaking back. To hear a laugh, bright and alive, is not just strange, it is revolutionary, because laughter means life, and life means connection, and connection means they are not alone. Think about what that does to a person. You laughed once, casually, carelessly, and they hear it as a message carved into eternity. For them, it is proof of a parallel existence, an unseen neighbor just beyond their horizon. They will play it over and over, slowing it down, isolating its tone, tracing every tremble. Was it joy? Was it relief? Was it madness? The laugh becomes scripture, dissected, worshipped, feared, scholars debate it. Priests use it as evidence. Children grow up hearing stories of the mysterious laugh that pierced the silence of the universe. And in their world, you are not just a stranger. You are the signal sender, the one whose laugh slipped through the veil. Your sound becomes a beacon. They build devices to catch more, waiting, desperate. For years they may hear nothing but static, but still they return, night after night, because once, they caught proof. And proof is enough to bind an entire civilization in hope. Do you see how terrifying that is? That something so small in your world could become the axis of another? Here your laugh vanished in seconds. There it became a story powerful enough to shift the direction of science, religion, even destiny. It is the butterfly effect of sound. Fragile, fleeting, yet unstoppable once released. History has always shown us how easily the faintest signal can change everything. When radio operators first heard pulsars, they thought it was intelligent life, LGM, little green men sending code across space. When explorers saw northern lights crackling, they thought it was God speaking in color. When the first radio waves leapt from one continent to another, people wept as if the world had folded in half. And yet, those were deliberate signals built by design. Your laugh was not. Your laugh was an accident. And perhaps that is why it matters more. Because the truest messages are the ones we never meant to send. Somewhere in that other world, the receiver sits in silence, waiting for you again. Maybe it has been decades. Maybe the one who first heard you has died, but their children continue the vigil, ears pressed to machines, hearts leaning into the static. All because your laugh once proved the void was not empty. And though you will never know it, though in this world you keep walking beneath street lamps forgetting the sound you made, in theirs, you are legend. You are the ghost who spoke, the proof of neighbors beyond the sky. And if you listen closely enough, maybe you have felt it too. A tingle when you laugh at night, as if someone, somewhere is listening. The strange hush after, as though the darkness is catching its breath. What if laughter itself is a kind of transmission, more powerful than words, slipping between the cracks of reality to remind others that joy exists, even here? So, do not dismiss the sound you make in passing. In one world, it is nothing. In another, it is everything. Because once, you laughed into the night, and through the fractures of existence, someone received it. And they have never stopped listening. The Masked Actor. The theater was almost empty that night. A scattering of tired faces, half-filled seats, the faint smell of dust rising from old curtains. The performer stood on stage, heart pounding beneath the mask that concealed his trembling mouth. He had practiced for months, but doubt was louder than memory, and fear heavier than costume. He thought of failure, of laughter, of the silence that would follow if no one cared. And then, in the stillness, your hands clapped. It was not a roar, not a thunderous ovation, but the steady rhythm of one person choosing to be present. Your clapping became a rope thrown across a dark chasm. He seized it. He breathed again. He continued. And as he did, something shifted. His voice steadied. His gestures stretched larger, bolder, no longer apologizing for taking space. The play unfurled like a storm breaking free of clouds. Others joined in their applause, but he always remembered yours first, the single pair of hands that gave him the courage to continue. That night was not recorded in history here. To you, it was a minor gesture, forgotten before you returned home. But in another dimension, the ripples grew wild. The masked actor became more than a performer. His art reshaped the myths of his world. Where once the old stories had shackled people to fear and submission, he rewrote them into living, breathing visions of defiance and renewal. He gave his people new gods, human ones, flawed ones, heroes who stumbled yet rose again. His plays were whispered in alleys, staged in secret halls, smuggled across borders like contraband hope. And when the rulers tried to silence him, the people carried his words anyway. An entire generation was raised on the courage that your hands first gave him. It is almost unbearable to realize how small you thought your action was. A moment of politeness, perhaps. A reflex, not even conscious. And yet, it carried across worlds, unfolding like fire in dry grass. Without your clapping, the silence might have crushed him. He might have walked away that night, mask abandoned, story buried. But because you chose to affirm him, however briefly, his art endured. And through that endurance, a dimension rewrote itself. Consider the power hidden in affirmation. A teacher's nod, a stranger's smile, a parent's whisper of pride. How many lives are steered by these seemingly weightless gestures? How many voices survive because someone, somewhere, decided to clap? The reverse is equally true. How many voices have been lost to silence, to absence, to the cruelty of indifference? History is not only shaped by kings and battles, it is shaped by the anonymous chorus of encouragement, by the hands that clap at the right moment. The masked actor himself never forgot. In interviews, in his journals, in letters passed between theaters and prisons, he wrote about that moment, how the applause of a single soul became the first stone in the foundation of his life's work. He called it proof that art could reach, even when fragile, proof that behind the mask, trembling, there was still someone worth hearing. And though he never knew your name, he carried the echo of your hands as if it were sacred. What's astonishing is that we live unaware of these echoes in our own lives. Somewhere someone may remember you as their first applause, their first encouragement, their first tether when they thought of letting go. You might never know it, but you live in their story as the nameless witness who believed in them when no one else did. And in this way, every one of us becomes a quiet author of myths, not through the stories we tell, but through the stories we enable others to tell. And so, the question becomes, who will you clap for? Who will you encourage, even if it feels small, even if you think it doesn't matter? Because the smallest affirmation might not only change a person, it might change the myths of entire dimensions. In another world, your hands have already done it. The masked actor stood on a stage, trembling in the dark, and you gave him light. And from that light, he built suns for others to walk beneath. You will never know the myths his people now tell. You will never know the faces of children raised on plays that began with your single act. But you can be certain of this. In some corner of existence, your clapping is still echoing. It lives in the courage of strangers, in the dreams of rebels, in the laughter of audiences who never knew your name. You are immortal there, not as the star, not as the hero, but as the one who said, with the sound of your hands, "Go on." You are not alone. And perhaps, in the secret mathematics of all universes, that is the greatest role you will ever play. The prisoner's hope. There are people the world forgets long before death claims them. They live behind walls, beneath iron bars, in silence so thick it devours their names. History barely remembers their existence, and when it does, it reduces them to numbers, to files, to crimes. Yet even there, in the hollow belly of captivity, hope sometimes survives. Not through speeches or miracles, but through something quieter, a kindness, a moment, a gesture so small it almost vanished from your own memory, but to them it became everything. You may not even recall what you did. Perhaps it was a word you spoke when others turned away. Perhaps it was food passed through a gate. Perhaps it was only your eyes meeting theirs without judgment, reminding them they were still human. To you, it cost nothing. To them, it was the only tether left in a life unraveling. They carried that memory through every locked night, every shouted command, every sound of keys turning in doors that would not open. When despair pressed in, when the walls shrank around them, they returned to that single moment like a flame cupped in their hands. Prison does not only confine the body, it starves the spirit. It convinces the forgotten that they no longer matter, that the outside world has erased them. But your kindness cut a crack in that illusion. Through it, light spilled. Enough light for them to imagine that one day, beyond the bars, a different life might wait. Enough light to endure. Psychologists who study survival in isolation often find that it is not grand visions that keep captives alive. It is fragments. A remembered smile, a song half heard through a wall, a face pressed into memory like a pressed flower. These fragments become lifelines, repeated endlessly until they grow roots inside the mind. Your kindness became one of those fragments. In the ledger of your days, it was a moment too small to mark. In theirs, it was salvation. Consider how fragile hope is, and how stubborn. It does not need proof, only memory. And when memory fades, it builds itself from imagination. The prisoner took your gesture, replayed it, carved it deeper each time until it became more than what happened. It became a promise. That somewhere beyond the walls, kindness existed. That they were not invisible. That their suffering was not the whole truth of their life. And so, in that parallel existence of the mind, your kindness multiplied. Each night in their cell, they built new versions of it. They imagined more words you might have spoken. They imagined a friendship that might have been had the world been different. They imagined freedom colored by your face. And though these imaginings were illusions, they gave the prisoner what iron could not strip away, the will to survive. This is the strange power of small acts. You never know which ones are lifted from your hands like seeds, carried into places you will never see. You never know which ones bloom in barren soil. A glance, a word, a fragment of kindness may be the only thing keeping someone alive at this very moment. Perhaps that is what the prisoner's hope teaches us, that the walls we see are not the only ones that matter. Loneliness, grief, shame, these are prisons too, and your smallest act of recognition may ripple through someone else's captivity, giving them a reason to endure one more day. You will never know the full reach of what you gave. They could not tell you, locked away as they were. Yet, in their silence, in their endurance, your gesture lived on. It was the heartbeat beneath despair. It was the memory they clung to when nothing else remained. So, the next time you wonder whether your kindness matters, remember this. Someone, somewhere, may already be surviving because of you. Someone may be holding on to a moment you barely noticed, replaying it like a song in the dark. Someone may be alive today because when the world forgot them, you did not. The stranger in chains. Picture a man in chains. His wrists are raw, his ankles bruised, iron biting into flesh that has long forgotten softness. He has lived so long inside captivity that the chains are not only on his body, they have settled into his mind. To him, freedom is a word without shape, a sound that belongs to other people's mouths, never his own. He does not even imagine release anymore. He imagines only endurance, and then you arrive, not with keys, not with weapons, not with force. You arrive with words. Perhaps you did not even mean them as salvation. Perhaps you asked the question, if a bird sings while caged, is it still free? Or maybe you said, no chain is unbreakable if your mind refuses to wear it. Simple, almost careless words. But to him, they were a strike against the iron, sharper than any blade. For the first time, he realized the truth. Freedom is not merely the absence of chains. It is the refusal to let chains define you. From that moment on, he was no longer only a prisoner. Something shifted in the marrow of his being. The walls, the guards, the locked gates, they remained. But his mind widened, as though doors opened where there had been only stone. He began to test the shape of his thoughts, and in them he found vastness. He was free in places his captors could not touch. And when the day of his release came, whether by mercy, by escape, or by death, he stepped out not as the same man who had once been bound, but as one remade. And he carried your words like fire. He told others, and they too began to question what freedom really means. Soon it spread. To some, freedom was no longer about open fields or the absence of chains, but about the strength to refuse ownership of the soul. Whole groups of monks, rebels, seekers, and wanderers built their philosophies around this idea that liberty begins not with the body, but with the mind. And what began as your passing words became the framework for lives, for movements, for generations who looked at chains and saw only illusions. History is filled with such moments. Think of Epictetus, born a slave in Rome, who taught Stoicism to the world, saying that no one can chain a person's will without consent. Think of Viktor Frankl, who survived concentration camps and declared that the last freedom is the choice of attitude in the face of suffering. Think of countless revolutionaries who began with nothing but words that shattered invisible prisons long before the visible ones fell. The stranger in chains, whom you once spoke to, became part of this long, unbroken chain of transformed souls who turned suffering into philosophy. But here is what makes your story different. You may never know it. To you, it may have been a passing conversation, a flicker of compassion, a question asked and forgotten. To him, it was everything. And across another strand of existence, across monasteries, villages, and generations, your words are still being repeated, still breaking chains that never touched your hands. This is the hidden power of language. It does not rust, it does not shatter, it does not decay. A chain can bind a man's body, but a sentence, once it takes root, outlives iron. Your words became his torch, his weapon, his scripture. And because of you, a stranger once bound in silence now lives free, and countless others after him live freer still. And perhaps that is what freedom truly is. Not the absence of chains, but the presence of truth spoken at the right moment, to the right soul in the darkest hour. You were the stranger's key, and you will never see how far your words traveled, but somewhere, even now, they are still unlocking doors. The Planet Watcher. They called them the Planet Watcher, though at first they were just a child with a notebook and a restless gaze. Their story began with something so ordinary you might have forgotten it. The way you once described the night sky. Perhaps it was casual, a moment under the stars when you gestured upward and said, "That one looks like a hunter," or "That cluster reminds me of an ocean wave." To you, it was nothing more than conversation, a fleeting attempt to paint the sky with words. But for the child listening, it became destiny. Your description was not just poetry. It was a compass, a seed lodged in their imagination, a spark that flared into an unquenchable fire. From that night forward, they could not look at the heavens without seeing not emptiness, but stories waiting to be mapped. They began with crude sketches, circles for moons, dots for stars, lines connecting constellations that only they could see. Their schoolbooks filled with secret diagrams, their margins crowded with orbits and imagined names. While others slept, they pressed their face against cold windows, charting the glittering vault above with the stubborn dedication of someone convinced the sky was speaking directly to them. And all the while, your casual description echoed in their mind, guiding their eyes, shaping their vision. They became not just an observer, but a translator, turning mystery into maps, turning silence into geometry. And then the work deepened. The child grew, but the obsession grew faster. They built makeshift telescopes from scavenged lenses, recorded the drift of stars across seasons, traced invisible paths through the darkness. Their notebooks multiplied, stacked like bricks of a tower reaching upward. Soon, their vision expanded beyond the sky they knew. They began to imagine galaxies, spirals and clusters spinning beyond the reach of sight. They charted worlds no eye had ever seen, but that felt as real to them as the ground beneath their feet. In their private universe, planets had names, atmospheres, histories. Civilizations bloomed in margins of paper. What began as curiosity had become creation. But here lies the wonder. In their strand of reality, the galaxies they charted were not inventions. They were discoveries. Astronomers in that world would later confirm what the child had already written years before. Distant clusters unfolded exactly as their pencil had drawn. Worlds long hidden in darkness gleamed exactly where they had placed them. The child's obsession became prophecy, and your casual words became the foundation of an entirely new astronomy. You had not given them knowledge, you had given them hunger. And hunger, when relentless, becomes revelation. Think of it. A child, armed with nothing more than ink and imagination, redrew the very scale of the universe. Entire star systems bore the echo of their curiosity. Kingdoms on distant planets aligned their calendars to constellations the Planet Watcher had charted. And it all began because, on one night, you looked up and chose to describe what you saw instead of keeping silent. But the story is not only about stars, it is about us. How many times have we underestimated the power of a word spoken to a child? A sentence meant to fill silence can become the axis of someone else's life. A casual comment about the sky, a fleeting metaphor about light, can grow into a pursuit that spans decades, reshaping worlds. You did not mean to create an astronomer, but you did. You did not mean to tilt a universe into alignment, but you did. And if such a small gesture can echo into galaxies, what else in our lives has grown from words we no longer even remember speaking? The Planet Watcher was not untouched by the burden. Obsession has a cost. Nights blurred into years. Their friends grew older, their lives widening into families and trades, while the Watcher's life narrowed into a tunnel of ink and starlight. They became broken in one sense, cut off from the warmth of Earth, living more fully in the sky than on the ground. Yet, in that brokenness lay brilliance. Because they chose distance, others could live closer. Because they abandoned the ordinary, others could inherit the extraordinary. The galaxies they mapped became common knowledge, guiding sailors, explorers, and wanderers across worlds they themselves never visited. Some say the Planet Watcher disappeared one evening, vanishing into the very stars they had charted. Others believe they still live in every child who looks up and refuses to see the sky as empty. For when we stare at the night long enough, we begin to hear it speak, not in language, but in invitation. And that invitation often begins with someone else's words, tossed into the dark, received by ears that make them eternal. So remember this. When you speak, especially to the young, you are not just filling silence. You are sketching galaxies on the walls of their imagination. You are planting constellations that may guide them long after you have forgotten. You may never see the worlds they build, the maps they draw, the galaxies they chart. But somewhere, in another strand, a child is still holding your words like a telescope, aiming them at the infinite. And in doing so, they are redrawing the very heavens, one star at a time. It started with a slip of the hand, ink trailing across paper, a name scribbled absent-mindedly, almost by mistake. Perhaps you were distracted. Perhaps it was a doodle that formed letters without thought. Perhaps you were practicing a signature or leaving your mark where no one would ever bother to look. In this world, it was nothing. A forgotten scrawl in a diary or notebook, a line among thousands. But in another world, far away across the branching veins of history, that single inscription became scripture. That name, your name, was found, studied, and revered until it shaped the course of nations. Imagine a time centuries later in that world, when dust-thick scholars bent over cracked pages, lifting the faint trace of ink with trembling fingers. They whispered the letters as though they were spells. Your name did not read like a person's. It read like a prophecy. Who was this figure? Why did their name appear without context, without explanation? To them, it could not be random. In their minds, no word written survives by accident, and so they declared it holy. Over time, stories formed around you, stories you never lived. They decided you must have been a prophet, one who wrote in silence and left a name as a key for the faithful to discover. Others swore you were a forgotten monarch, a hidden savior, or a traveler from the stars. Wars were waged over interpretations of your name. Temples rose to honor it. Songs were sung where each syllable of your letters was drawn out like a hymn. To whisper your name became an act of devotion. To deface it was heresy punishable by fire. Consider how terrifying that is. In your world, you forgot the page. In theirs, it became the foundation of truth. This is how history works, not as a record of certainty, but as an accumulation of stories built around fragments, assumptions, and echoes. Archaeologists have unearthed a broken shard of pottery, and from it written volumes about civilizations. A single line scratched into stone has shaped entire understandings of gods and kings. The Rosetta Stone gave us languages. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave us faith. Why should your name, scribbled in haste, not become the axis of another universe's belief? Think of the fragility of meaning. A diary is meant to be private, messy, human. But when unearthed centuries later, every line becomes sacred. The doodle in the margin becomes a symbol. The mistake in spelling becomes doctrine. Even in our own world, how many texts are worshipped, argued over, translated 1,000 times, each word taken as holy, when perhaps their authors never intended such weight. Meaning is not always what the writer gives. Meaning is what survives, and how others choose to see it. In that other reality, generations debated your name. Was it a warning? A promise? Did it mark the coming of a Messiah, or the return of one long lost? Some claimed you had already walked among them in disguise, your name left behind as proof. Others believed you were still to come, and they waited through wars, through famine, through centuries of silence for you to arrive. And every moment of waiting reinforced the sanctity of the word. You were no longer a person. You were possibility incarnate. Meanwhile, here, you moved on. That notebook was closed, lost, or thrown away. The ink faded, the paper rotted, and yet, in another strand of reality, your name became eternal. That is the strange cruelty of existence, that our smallest accidents can be monuments elsewhere, that we may never know the weight our gestures carry, or the worship they inspire. Ask yourself, if you knew your name had become scripture in another world, would you feel honored or terrified? Would you laugh at the absurdity or tremble at the responsibility? Because the truth is this: we are all accidental prophets. Every word we write, every trace we leave behind can outlive us and be reborn into meanings we never dreamed of. Your name, once a careless scrawl, became sacred law. Your mistake became someone else's eternity. And perhaps even now, as you listen, someone in that world is whispering your name in prayer, waiting for you to return. The Lighthouse Child. You lifted a lantern once, a simple act, born not of destiny but of instinct. Perhaps you were walking the coast at dusk. Perhaps you were merely curious, holding up the small light against the growing fog. You did not know who was out there, searching, frightened, lost. You only knew that the darkness was heavy, and that the lantern felt warmer when raised than when lowered. To you, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. Somewhere beyond the reach of your sight, a child was wandering. The sea was black, the cliffs sharp, the air filled with a silence that pressed on the chest like a hand. She was small, her steps unsteady, her mind already surrendering to fear. Then she saw it. A glow cutting through the night, a lantern swaying faintly like a star held by human hands. She followed. Every step toward that light was a step away from despair, and when she finally reached safety, the image of that lantern burned into her memory, not as an accident, but as a salvation. You went home that night, perhaps never thinking of it again. But in her world, in her bloodline, that memory became an inheritance. She grew up remembering not only the fear, but the miracle of being found. And she told that story to her children. She told it not as a fleeting incident, but as proof. Proof that light exists even when the night is deepest. Proof that somewhere, someone will lift a lantern when you are lost. Her children grew up with that fire in their veins, and when they had children of their own, they passed the memory forward. Generation after generation carried the story of the lantern bearer until it became less a tale and more a part of their marrow. They became a people who searched for the lost, who lifted lights high, who made the act of guiding others home into a sacred duty. All because once you raised your hand. This is the mystery of memory, that it does not always belong to the one who experiences it. Sometimes it belongs to those who inherit it, those who grow within its gravity. We think of heritage as blood and bone, but heritage is also story, belief, and the habits carved by someone else's kindness. The Lighthouse Child became a woman who lived by that story, and her descendants became a lineage defined by it. And you, who forgot, are still present in every flicker of every lamp they carry. Consider how fragile the act was. You did not build a beacon tower. You did not command a fleet. You did not carve your name into stone. You lifted a lantern, that was all. Yet that gesture became scripture for a family in another dimension. It became their myth, their compass, their proof that no one is ever truly alone in the dark. When the storms came, they told the children, look for the lantern. When doubt swallowed them, they whispered, someone will lift it for you. And when courage was needed, they became the ones to raise the flame themselves. History is full of such transformations. The smallest actions magnified by time, distorted into legend, enshrined as truth. A warrior remembered not for the battles he lost, but for the one wound he endured. A saint remembered not for the words she spoke, but for the single embrace she gave. A people who followed a trail of stones, long after the one who laid them had forgotten. And in that other dimension, you became one of those figures, not by choice, not by will, but by the alchemy of memory. And here is the haunting beauty of it. You will never know how far your gestures travel. You will never meet the descendants who carry your story in their blood. You will never see the towns built on the faith of a lantern, but somewhere, in another thread of reality, you are alive in them. They tell your story without your name. They lift their lamps because you once lifted yours. Their children grow strong because your shadow lit the way for one frightened child in the fog. What does this mean for us, here and now? It means that we are leaving inheritances in every action, whether we know it or not. The way you speak to a stranger may echo in the way their grandchildren see the world. The moment you choose to help or to turn away may not die when you do. It may live on, transformed, until it is unrecognizable even to you, and that is terrifying, yes. But it is also beautiful, because it means that meaning does not end with us. It multiplies. The Lighthouse Child grew old, and when she died, her descendants lit lanterns at the shore in her honor. They did not mourn her with silence, but with flame. The cliffs were dotted with light, dozens of small fires swaying against the wind. From far away, it must have looked like the horizon had been stitched with stars, and every one of those flames carried the echo of yours. Everyone whispered, "She was saved, and because she was saved, we are here." You will not be remembered by name. Your face will not appear in their genealogies, but in every lantern they raise, you are alive. The warmth in their hands is the warmth you once held, and in the secret architecture of their world, you are not a passerby, you are the foundation. So walk carefully, though not fearfully. Know that the smallest light you lift may become a constellation in another sky. Know that every act of kindness may live longer than you, deeper than you, more widely than you ever imagined. And when you wonder whether your life matters, remember this. Somewhere, in another universe, an entire bloodline carries your lantern still. The silent judge. There are words we speak that vanish as soon as breath leaves the lips. They hang in the air for a heartbeat, then dissolve into nothingness. We assume they are gone, harmless, forgotten. But sometimes, they travel farther than we imagine. Sometimes, a passing remark becomes an anchor in another person's mind, an echo that refuses to fade. And if that person sits in a place of power, if that echo lingers in the silence of their decision-making, then your words may shape the course of history. So it was with the silent judge. You did not know them. You did not know their title, their robes, their weight of responsibility. To you, they were simply another face in a moment you barely remember. Maybe you spoke to them in a market, maybe on a street corner, maybe while waiting for a carriage or a bus. Perhaps you did not even speak to them directly. Perhaps your words floated near them, overheard but not intended. Yet something in those words struck deep, a phrase, an idea, a perspective. Nothing that seemed monumental at the time, but the judge carried it with them, tucked away like a stone in the pocket of thought. Later, alone in chambers, when the weight of a verdict pressed upon them, that stone rolled back into their hand. They remembered your words, they repeated them, and though you will never know it, those words tipped the balance. They became the quiet compass that turned a judgment one way instead of another, and that judgment did not end with one case. It rippled outward, precedents formed, laws shifted, generations inherited a different framework of justice. A single phrase, once careless, became the hidden hand that redirected centuries of law. History often speaks of great reforms and landmark rulings as if they were born fully from the minds of remarkable individuals. But minds are sponges. They absorb fragments from the world, glances, stories, phrases dropped in passing. The judge may have believed the idea was their own, but it was seeded by you. A truth you offered lightly, a perspective you never thought mattered, became the foundation of decisions that shaped nations. Think of the weight of this. Entire societies may be walking on paths paved by words you have already spoken. Perhaps rights were upheld, or freedoms granted, because a thought you once gave away survived in another mind. Perhaps punishments were softened, or dignity restored, because your voice lingered in a place where silence was expected. Perhaps someone centuries from now still quotes laws written in the shadow of your words, never knowing where the echo began. It is both humbling and terrifying. How much of history is truly ours? How much of it is the sum of invisible influences? The stranger's remark, the overheard conversation, the teacher's forgotten lecture, the parent's quiet story before bed. Law, like memory, is not built in isolation. It is an archive of echoes, and you may already live inside its pages without ever knowing it. The silent judge carried your voice across the threshold of decision, and though you will never stand in those courts, though your name is absent from the records, you are there. Your words are hidden in the ink, disguised as reason, folded into logic, but alive nonetheless. Every gavel that fell afterward carried a trace of you. So when you speak, remember this: no word is truly small. Even the most fleeting remark may live longer than you, shaping the invisible architecture of lives and laws. You may already be a legislator in worlds you will never see. Not because you sought power, not because you sought recognition, but because you once spoke, and someone, listening in silence, never forgot. The Geneticist spark. Imagine a quiet laboratory, the air heavy with the scent of sterile glass and metal. A young geneticist sits hunched over her notes, exhausted by years of chasing answers that seem just out of reach. She has mapped strands of DNA until the letters blur together, searching for meaning in the endless spiral of life. Progress is slow, riddled with false starts, fragile hope, and too many failures. And then, your voice. Not a lecture, not a discovery of your own, but a question. So simple it almost felt childlike. But what is life, really, if not a code waiting to be read? She froze, because no one had asked it that way before. Everyone around her spoke of molecules, proteins, sequences, mutations, but your words reframed the entire puzzle. Not just chemistry, but language. If life was a code, then perhaps it could be read. If it could be read, then maybe it could be written. And if it could be written, then rewritten. That single question became the spark she needed. Her research shifted. She began to look at DNA not as an abstract pattern, but as a living alphabet, a story woven into the flesh of existence. Years passed, others joined her. The question spread from lab to lab, whispered in conferences, scribbled on the corners of notebooks. A new generation of scientists began to see biology not as a locked vault, but as a text that could be decoded. And then came the breakthroughs: faster sequencing, deeper understanding of mutations, the unlocking of genetic therapies. What once seemed impossible became the foundation of a new reality. And in another strand of existence, entire worlds were reshaped by that spark. Diseases that had haunted humanity for centuries fell away. Inherited suffering, once passed like curses from parent to child, was rewritten, healed at its root. Viruses were outmaneuvered, cancers dismantled, aging slowed. Life expectancy stretched, but more importantly, life quality deepened. People walked into clinics not with fear, but with hope, because cures had become abundant. And in every discovery, in every breakthrough, there was the quiet ghost of your question, still whispering its reminder: life is a code, and codes can be understood. History has shown us how often revolutions are seeded not by grand declarations, but by small questions. Mendel asked why pea plants inherited traits in such predictable ways, and the science of genetics was born. Watson and Crick asked what held DNA together, and the double helix revealed itself. Today, CRISPR exists because someone asked whether the defense system of a bacteria could be reprogrammed to edit life itself. Every turning point begins with a mind daring to ask what others had overlooked. You joined this lineage, even without realizing it. And what makes it haunting is this: you may never know. You asked your question and walked away, unaware of its weight. But elsewhere, it carried like a spark in dry grass, igniting flames you never saw. 1,000 lives were saved, 1,000 more transformed, because one scientist heard your voice and chose to see differently. Your question became their compass, and their work became the hope of generations. And perhaps this is what progress really is. Not the slow grind of data alone, but the collision of wonder with persistence. Not just facts, but questions that open doors no one knew existed. You gave that door to them, and through it, entire civilizations walked into a new era of medicine, healing, and possibility. Somewhere, in a world you will never visit, children live free of diseases that once defined their lineage. Families thrive without fear of hereditary pain, and every one of those futures was seeded quietly by you, the stranger who asked a question about life, the geneticist's spark, the fire starter of a revolution you will never see, yet which will forever carry your imprint. The timeless stranger, they called him the timeless stranger, though in truth he was only you, shifted, displaced, rewritten in another strand of existence. The story begins in a moment so small you might never notice it. A crossing, a stumble, a wheel sliding across wet stone. In this other thread of reality, someone was meant to die that day. Their fate had been sealed, etched into the silence of an unlit street, but you appeared, or rather, a version of you, stepping in at the precise second, pulling them back, pushing them aside, holding them steady against the violence of chance. And just like that, destiny fractured. The accident did not claim its victim. History did not unfold the way it was meant to. And in that fracture, the timeless stranger was born. For the person you saved was never meant to live beyond that moment. The world had already written their ending. Yet by surviving, they became something else. An echo wandering through time, reshaping everything they touched. At first, it seemed simple. A stranger spared from death walks away, shaken but alive. But every heartbeat after became a ripple. The child they went on to raise, the book they later wrote, the protest they ignited, the kindness they gave, all of it existed only because you were there in that instant. And the world, which had once prepared to bury them, now had to carry them. What was spared in seconds became centuries of consequences. Think of the weight of that. One act of reflex, one interruption of fate, and suddenly whole generations are altered. A kingdom survives because the spared stranger's descendant leads an army. A disease is cured because their grandchild refuses to accept a death sentence. Wars are prevented. Inventions are born. Songs are written. All because a stranger was pulled away from the edge at the exact moment destiny thought it had claimed them. And no one remembers. No one knows. Only the timeless stranger, a shadow of you, watching history twist around a moment that should have ended but didn't. But saving a life not meant to be saved is not without cost. Reality resists. The spared stranger lived, yes, but with them came fractures. Memories misaligned. People recalled events that never happened. Friendships with those who should have been gone. Photographs developing faces that didn't belong. Some swore the survivor always existed. Others swore they never had. Families fought over whether they had buried someone who was still walking among them. The timeless stranger's gift was not clean salvation. It was disruption, a splintering of the script. And once a story has been rewritten, it cannot be neatly erased. Still, the stranger endured. The one who was spared walked through their life carrying a faint unease, as though the world wasn't quite solid beneath their feet. They often dreamed of the accident that never finished, waking with the sound of shattering glass or the taste of iron in their mouth. But they also carried gratitude, fierce and burning, though they could not name to whom. They knew, somehow, that they had been rescued by someone who wasn't meant to be there, a presence they could never recall fully, but always felt, a timeless stranger. And here lies the haunting reflection. How many times in our own lives have we been spared by seconds? The missed bus that prevented the collision, the sudden hesitation before stepping into the road, the stranger's arm pulling us back when we weren't looking. Do we not all live as echoes of accidents that never quite finished? Each of us is a ripple from some fracture, spared by chance or by someone unseen. The timeless stranger's story is not one of applause. No songs are written for the disaster that never happened. The world moves on, forgetting what was avoided. Yet in the silence of survival lies the deepest mystery. What lives continue because a fate was delayed? What inventions, what loves, what revolutions are only possible because someone did not die when the script demanded they should? Some say the timeless stranger still walks among us, invisible in the moments where tragedy bends and misses. They are the hand on the shoulder that makes you pause before the train passes, the voice that makes you turn your head just before the car swerves, the feeling that someone is near though the street is empty. Perhaps it is only chance, or perhaps it is a version of you reaching across strands of time, saving someone you'll never meet in this world, but whose survival will echo forever in another. So the next time you feel that pause, that hesitation, that delay that makes no sense but saves you all the same, ask yourself, who was it? Chance? Destiny? Or a timeless stranger, maybe even another version of you, rewriting the fragile script of fate? And remember this, every survival is a story not yet told, every accident a doorway not yet crossed, and every life you pass may exist only because somewhere, someone once reached out and refused to let go. The Forgotten Painter. He was almost invisible in his own lifetime, a painter whose name was rarely spoken, whose works hung not in grand halls but in dusty corners of taverns, in the quiet chambers of those who could not afford better. His brush was his companion, his colors his confession, but history never turned its gaze toward him. His canvases, like fragile windows, captured fleeting faces, landscapes forgotten by time, scenes of daily life that no critic bothered to praise. And yet, in another world, one canvas refused to be forgotten. One canvas, his last, became immortal. And at the center of that canvas was your smile. He painted it without your permission, without your knowing. Perhaps you sat across from him in a market, laughing at something too small to matter. Perhaps you passed him once, and the curve of your lips lodged in his memory like a seed that demanded soil. Perhaps you never even noticed him at all. But he noticed you. To him, your smile was not just an expression. It was the axis of light. It was the fragile proof that beauty could survive even in a world that did not see him. And so, on his final canvas, weak hands trembling, breath shallow from illness, he gave everything to preserve it. Here, in your world, that canvas was lost. It moldered in an attic, was sold for a handful of coins, or simply decayed into silence. But in another world, it endured. It was found. And when it was, everything changed. Scholars debated its technique, marveling at how such an obscure painter captured something beyond style, beyond training. They saw eternity in your smile. To them, it was not merely paint on cloth, it was revelation. Over generations, the painting became legend. Crowds gathered to see it, not because of the painter's forgotten name, but because of the face within. Your smile, immortalized, became the subject of poems, of songs, of pilgrimages. They called it divine, a glimpse of something eternal woven into mortal features. Children were brought to stand before it, told that this was proof of goodness in the world. Lovers swore their vows beneath it, promising to honor a beauty that never died. Wars were paused, so soldiers could kneel in its presence before returning to the field. Your smile became an anchor of meaning, binding together lives that would otherwise have drifted apart. And yet, you never knew. You walked through your own life unaware that, in another reality, your fleeting expression became the axis of culture. You never felt the hands trembling as they painted you into permanence. You never saw the crowds gathered in wonder centuries later, whispering your image as if it contained answers to questions too vast to speak aloud. You lived and died, never knowing that another version of history bowed to the memory of a smile you once gave away without thinking. Do you see the strangeness of it? That immortality can rest on moments so small they do not even belong to us. We are told that greatness requires intention, that legacies are forged by will, by conquest, by brilliance. And yet, in truth, many of history's immortals were accidents. A nameless handprint on a cave wall, a melody hummed that became folklore, a diary page preserved by chance, shaping belief. In that other world, you joined them, not by choice, but by being seen, by being remembered at the right moment, by the right forgotten soul. The painter's own story was erased, but yours endured because he gave his last strength to it. That is the cruel irony. He sought recognition, but found only obscurity, while you, unwilling, unknowing, became the immortal face. He vanished into footnotes, and you rose into myth. The final brushstroke of his life ensured that your smile would outlive him by centuries, carved into the collective memory of a world where art was never just pigment but prayer. And perhaps, when you smile even now, something echoes of that canvas. Perhaps you carry in your face the shadow of an immortality you will never see, but which exists elsewhere, lighting the hearts of strangers who whisper your image like a secret. You will never walk into the halls where your painted smile hangs, never hear the hush that falls as people gather to look upon you, but you exist there forever. Because once, in another world, a forgotten painter saw your smile and made it impossible to forget. The Sleepless Dreamer. There are dreams that vanish the moment we open our eyes. They slip through the cracks of waking like water through fingers, leaving nothing but a faint dampness of memory. And then there are dreams that cling, stubborn and luminous, as if they refuse to admit they were never real. Imagine this. Someone in another dimension lay sleeping, restless, caught between shadows and silence. And then, through the fragile veil of night, their dream brushed against yours, two minds grazing across the boundary of worlds. You never knew it. You turned in your sleep, unaware that your presence had been carried like wind into another life. But they woke certain of one thing, that you were real. For them, it was not fantasy. It was encounter. They remembered the texture of your voice, the outline of your face, the weight of your presence, as though you had stood beside their bed. The dream was not hazy, not dissolving into vagueness as the hours passed. It was sharp. It was anchored. And though they had never seen you in their waking life, they carried you like a secret truth. A truth that whispered, somewhere across the immeasurable span of existence, someone else is out there, and I have touched them. Think of how such certainty can reshape a life. While others doubted, while others shrugged at mystery, the Sleepless Dreamer became a witness. They walked through their world with the conviction that connection is not bound by time or geography, not even by dimension. And that conviction grew like a vine, wrapping itself around everything they did. They wrote poems that sounded like invitations to the unseen. They painted canvases full of shadows reaching for light. They spoke of you, not by name, for they did not know it, but as if you were the proof that loneliness was a lie. And others, hearing the passion in their voice, began to believe as well. A single dream became a movement of thought. Philosophers debated the nature of such visions. Was it madness? Was it faith? Or was it, as the Sleepless Dreamer insisted, evidence of a world wider than their own senses could grasp? Children grew up on stories of dream bridges, believing that in sleep they might meet companions from other realms. Lovers claimed that their bonds stretched across lifetimes and dimensions, citing the dreamer's testimony as proof. And still, through it all, they remembered you, not as symbol, not as metaphor, but as real. Their pulse had quickened at your nearness. Their skin remembered the warmth of your imagined hand. They built their life around a certainty you never even knew you had given. How strange this is, to realize that while you slept, you may have become the cornerstone of someone else's truth. That your unconscious presence brushed the fabric of another soul so profoundly that they carried you through every waking hour. You never asked for this. You never even noticed. And yet, you are alive in their history, alive in their art, alive in the faith of their children. You became the dream that refused to stay a dream. And ask yourself, how many times has this happened to you? How many figures in your own dreams felt too vivid to be fiction? The stranger whose eyes you still remember, though you cannot place them. The voice that spoke a sentence so clear it haunts you still. The embrace that felt like reunion, though you had never met. Were those only fragments of your mind? Or were they, perhaps, brushings of other dreamers across the divide, waking in their world certain that you were real? Science cannot measure such encounters, yet memory insists. Dreams leave behind residue that is more than imagination. It is experience without explanation. And across dimensions, the Sleepless Dreamer lived by that residue, insisting that truth is larger than evidence. They changed their world with the courage to believe in what they felt. And you were the root of that courage. You were the ghost that proved to them that ghosts are real. Here is the paradox. The encounter meant nothing to you. You slept through it, unaware. Yet for them, it was the defining axis of a life. What does this reveal about the nature of meaning? That significance does not belong to intention alone, that we may change lives without knowledge, without will, that our presence, even unconscious, even accidental, can ripple into eternities we will never touch. You did nothing but dream, and in another world, that nothing became everything. The Sleepless Dreamer grew old, still speaking of you. In the last years of their life, they would close their eyes and whisper to the darkness, asking if perhaps you were listening. And though you never answered, though the silence never broke, they died with peace in their heart, for they believed they had known you. They believed that somewhere, out there, you lived, and that belief was enough. Their children built shrines to the idea. Their grandchildren turned it into myth. And generations later, an entire dimension spoke of the one who crossed a dream and proved that reality was porous. And you? You woke the next morning and never remembered. This is the strangeness of existence, that we are not the sole authors of our impact. Our lives leak into others without permission, without warning. A glance, a gesture, a word, or even the brush of a dream can define someone else's path. You may never know it, but somewhere right now, someone is living by the memory of you, certain that you are real. So, sleep gently, for even in your dreams, you are shaping worlds.